You hear things in bars. Secrets, regrets, lies polished into stories. Most of them are harmless. Some stick with you, though. One night, years ago, I heard something I still haven't shaken. It came from a priest in full collar, soaked in rain with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He walked into my bar like he'd just come from a funeral. But it was worse than that. A funeral has closure. This guy had the look of someone who'd seen something that didn't end. I wasn't going to tell anyone about it. Who would believe me anyway? But I've been dreaming about that night lately, waking up cold. And sometimes I swear Moses hears something I don't, staring at corners and growling at someone like there's something standing there. So here it is. I'm telling it now. Not for attention, not even for clarity. Just because it won't leave me alone. My name's David. I run a bar called The Last Light. It's out in the rural drag between a dead still town and a patch of state highway nobody cares enough to fix. We're open late, mostly for truckers and regulars who don't mind the silence. That night, there was no one left but me and Moses, my St. Bernard. And before you call the health authorities, don't worry, he doesn't even shed. Don't ask me how. It was storming, not loud but steady. You know the kind of rain that settles into the wood, makes the floor groan, like that. I was wiping down glasses when the door opened. No bell, just the creak of hinges and the cold sliding in. He stepped inside slow, tall, old, but not frail. A long black coat soaked through, collar turned up. And underneath it, the white square of a priest's collar. He looked like something out of a film reel. He didn't speak right away, just took off the coat, hung it neatly by the door, and walked to the bar. And sat down without asking, hands on the counter, pale like they'd seen no sun in weeks. Late for a collar, I said. I wasn't trying to be rude. I just don't like silence that thick. He looked up, eyes sharp, like a man looking through you to see someone who might be hiding inside. Wine, if you have it. I poured him a glass of the house red. Nothing fancy. He drank it like it was the first thing to have touched his mouth in days. You from around here? I asked. He shook his head. I lost a girl tonight. His voice was flat, no tremor, like he'd already repeated the line in his head 100 times. I didn't say anything, just waited. People talk when you let them. He stared at the glass, then back at me. You ever seen someone fight something you can't see? I was gonna make a joke. Say, sure, I've watched a man wrestle a tequila hangover. But something in his face stopped me. This wasn't small talk. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a rosary. Not to pray, just to hold. His fingers worked the beads like muscle memory. She was 16. He paused. You believe in possession, my friend? No, I believe in trauma, in mental breaks, in people cracking from things they can't carry. He smiled. Not like I was wrong, more like he'd said the same thing once. Then let me tell you what I saw. And when I'm done, you can decide if trauma explains it. He lifted the wine again, hand still shaking. I've seen the kind of evil that makes you question whether God's even looking. I nodded. Moses stirred by the jukebox, ears twitching. I glanced down. That damn dog was staring at the priest like he recognized him. And just like that, the night began. The first one he told me about was a man named Griggs, 69 years old, lived alone in a sagging two-story at the edge of a dead steel town in western Pennsylvania, a place with more broken windows than people. You wouldn't know the town's name unless you were from there, and even then, you probably tried to forget it. According to Mallory, the whole house smelled like damp brick and rusted metal, like the bones of the place were still sweating out factory air. Griggs had been a furnace man, smelted steel for 40 years. Big arms, thick neck. That quiet kind of mean that comes from a life spent eating smoke and swallowing losers. He'd watched his wife die of stomach cancer and buried his only son after a train accident. After that, he quit talking to most people. Didn't leave his property. Just sat there year after year until he wasn't part of the town anymore. Just one of its ghosts. The reports started with noise, constant digging, metal against concrete. At first, the neighbors thought he was fixing something. But weeks passed, then months. And people said the sounds kept getting deeper and angrier. When someone finally called the sheriff, they found Griggs shirtless in the basement, filthy and muttering to himself, trying to carve a pit beneath his own furnace with nothing but a crowbar and a pickaxe. He didn't resist arrest, didn't say much of anything. They took him in for his own safety. But when they booked him in, he said something in a language nobody understood. One of the deputies had a brother in the church. Quiet calls were made, and Mallory got the job. The priest didn't go alone. He brought 3 men, church muscle, all seminary types. Young, broad-shouldered, trained to hold down what prayer couldn't. There were 2 nuns as well. Older women, hardened by years of backroom rites and sleepless nights. They stayed upstairs in the kitchen reciting scripture and keeping candles lit. The basement was cold, not in the way you'd expect. Mallory said the temperature dropped like they'd stepped inside a freezer. You could see breath. There was no ventilation, no pipes overhead, just solid stone. This was, of course, after the police booked him and couldn't really hold him for anything, so they sent him back to his house and hoped he'd be all right. Mallory got there and didn't like the state Griggs was in. He could tell something was off. Him and his men took Griggs down to his basement and strapped him into a metal chair. Griggs was freaking out and yelling in all kinds of different languages. He even seemed to levitate a couple of inches during the struggle. They didn't have anything on hand to bind him down with except for an old fire hose that they found down there. "Back again, old man," Griggs said. Mallory had never met the man before. There was no question what they were dealing with at that point. The team began their prep. Relics, sacramentals, holy water, the Book of the Rite. Mallory knelt in front of Griggs and looked him in the eye. "Do you know who I am?" "More than you know yourself." They began the rite. Latin filled the basement. Psalms first. Invocation of the Trinity. Mallory kept his voice low but deliberate, pacing the words. Griggs didn't respond. At first. Then he started humming. Just a single note, barely there. The kind of sound that really gets into you. Mallory said it felt like the walls were picking it up, vibrating with it. One of the assistants glanced over, eyes wide. The note kept building. Then the furnace kicked on. No one touched it. The pilot was unlit, the gas disconnected. But it rumbled to life like it had something to prove. Heat poured into the room. Not warmth, but heat, like standing behind an open oven. Griggs stopped humming and started to speak. Not English, not gibberish, but German, fluent and fast, Old dialect, industrial slang, curses from a century ago. Mallory recognized it. He answered back in Latin, stronger now, invoking the saints by name. Griggs laughed. Not loud, almost kindly. Then came the voice. Mallory said it was like talking to two people at once. Griggs and something else layered beneath. The assistants gripped the straps tighter. One of the nuns upstairs shouted something and the candlelight flickered. Griggs turned to Mallory and said, clear as a bell, "You're wasting your time." Then his eyes rolled back. Mallory said that's when the smell hit. Like burnt copper and sulfur. Like the inside of a bomb. They hadn't even reached the midpoint to the right. That's where Mallory paused, looking at me across the bar. "You still think it's trauma?" he asked. I didn't answer. Moses let out a low whine under the jukebox. The priest sipped his wine and stared into it. "Next part's worse. That's where the real fight began." Mallory said the crucifix in his hand began to warm. Not heat from the room, something internal, like it was reacting to what sat in front of him. The steel felt alive. That was when Griggs started straining against the bindings. Not violently, not yet. Just testing them, like an animal filling out the limits of its cage. Mallory continued with the rite, voice rising, pace tightening. Latin filled the basement like smoke, thick and invasive, each word a nail in the boards of the room. Griggs's head jerked back so fast it cracked the top rail of the chair. One of the assistants flinched but held the strap. Mallory pressed the crucifix to Griggs' chest. The skin bubbled and blistered on contact. That's not a metaphor, that's what he said. Boiled like water hitting hot oil. And it wasn't the first time he'd done this. Not the first person who reacted this way. No screaming yet, though. Griggs just stared ahead unmoving, as if something inside him was watching the whole thing with clinical interest. Then the screaming started. Not human screaming either, something layered and distorted. Imagine a monster crying under a mountain of static. Someone trying to scream through gravel. One assistant backed into the corner and crossed himself. Another turned his head and vomited. Griggs began to speak in voices. Not just one at a time, but all of them at once. A dozen at least. Children whispering, a man coughing blood, a little girl humming a lullaby. Mallory said one of them was his own voice, and twisted, repeating something he hadn't said in 20 years. That stopped him cold for half a breath. He remembered it was something nasty he had told someone once out of anger. The furnace flared again. Mallory said it looked like the metal was about to tear open. Then the lights blew. They burst. Glass shards rained down. The nuns upstairs shrieked but didn't stop praying. In the dark, with only candlelight flickering in from above, Griggs lifted off the chair. Not all the way, just a few inches. Enough for every man in that room to feel gravity turn into a question. His mouth opened. A flood of black smoke poured out, thicker this time. It spilled across the floor, curling upwards like fingers. It smelled like burning hair and scorched copper and chemical sulfur. The men backed up. Mallory held his ground. He lifted the crucifix and screamed the name of Christ. He said it louder than he's ever said it in his life. Griggs convulsed. His eyes went fully white. His arms jerked at impossible angles, bones popping out of sockets. His wrists flapped loose against the restraints. His spine arched hard enough to crack the chair. The smoke thickened into a column and began to spin. Then it spoke. The smoke didn't echo Griggs' voice. It became a voice, deep and ancient. "You cannot unmake what you are." The assistants nearly fled. One had to be restrained by the others. The nuns were still praying. One had passed out. Mallory dropped the crucifix and took the flask of holy water. He threw it, not at Griggs, but into the smoke. It howled, in pain and anger. The floor cracked down the middle, a perfect line. The concrete split like paper. Something shifted beneath them. Mallory said the ground didn't sink. It rose, like something was pressing up from beneath. Then Griggs dropped. The smoke collapsed. The room went silent. No moans, no hum, no breath. Griggs's body slumped forward, neck bent. His eyes were open but blank, like a doll. Mallory didn't call it a success. The thing left. But it came with a price. Griggs didn't die that night, despite how it ended. He lived another 3 years. Mallory drank the last of his wine. I didn't ask anything. Didn't need to. Moses growled low, barely audible. He was staring at the corner of the bar. Nothing there but shadows. That was the first story, and Mallory hadn't even looked tired yet. You ever wonder, I finally asked, why it even works? Any of it? The prayers, the rite, the Latin? Mallory looked at me like he was checking whether I was asking out of curiosity or contempt. I wasn't sure myself. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the evil leaves because it's had its fun. Sometimes it stays until the body breaks. But when it does work, it ain't the words. It's the authority behind them. I nodded. Christ. He took a moment, eyes shifting down to the empty glass. Christ doesn't show up for theatrics. He shows up when he needs to. When it costs something. That sat between us a long time. Moses was quiet. Outside, the wind rattled the window like it wanted in. So what did it cost you? I asked. Everything. But not all at once. Piece by piece. The second story started quieter. Less fire and brimstone, more static and silence. That's how Mallory described it. He said it was the kind of case that didn't feel like much until it was far too late. Her name was Tina, 24 years old, lived alone, and paid her bills by babysitting for rich couples in the North Shore suburbs. No history of mental illness. Not especially religious. Social media painted the picture you'd expect. Sunlit selfies, brunch mimosas, a dog named Ezra. Normal. Mallory only got involved because one of the families she worked for had a cousin in the church who owed him a favor. Tina had taken a job watching a 1-year-old for a couple out in Westford. Big house, 3 floors, a smart security system, and 2 Teslas in the driveway. The mom said she got home around midnight, and the baby was screaming. Nothing unusual. But Tina was gone. Not outside, not in the kitchen, not on the couch. It took them an hour to find her wedged inside the crawl space behind the laundry unit, knees to her chest, eyes wide open, whispering into the baby monitor. The police were called. Tina didn't resist. She didn't speak either, though. She just kept whispering, even in the cruiser, repeating the same phrase over and over. They never blink. Mallory went to Tina's parents' house where she lived, and her parents had her bound to the bed. Her family didn't want to take her to a hospital. They didn't want a record. They just wanted whatever was wrong with her to stop being the problem. He found her surrounded by paper, notebook pages, paper towels, grocery receipts. All of them were filled with eyes. Not cartoonish ones, these were exact. Veins, lids, the moist gleam of a cornea. Dozens of them, hand-drawn with ballpoint pens and Sharpies. She'd even drawn one on the underside of her chin, just below the jawline. When Mallory walked in, she looked straight at him. Didn't blink, didn't smile, just said, "I saw you in the mirror. The one in Rome." He didn't answer. He just nodded to the men with him. 2 assistants, both quiet and focused. One of them unpacked the small silver case with the right. The other walked to the room's perimeter, unplugging everything. Tina didn't react until they shut the power off. Then she smiled, broad and unnatural. "You can't hide from them," she said. Mallory said the baby monitor had no power. The plug was still sitting on the floor, but it clicked on anyway. Static poured out. Then a voice. A little girl's voice. Something singing that sounded like a lullaby. The nuns stayed outside the room, one kneeling in the hallway, another pacing the upstairs corridor with a crucifix clutched in both hands. They began the psalms in tandem, slowly, as if easing themselves into battle. Mallory said the room had too many mirrors. 2 over the dresser, 1 over the closet door. He covered each with sheets. Tina didn't fight. She just started humming under her breath, same tune as a monitor. Then she turned her head and said, "Do you know what your face looks like from their side?" That was when the lights dimmed. He opened the book of the rite and began. Tina stared at the ceiling, lips moving in time with his Latin like she'd memorized the pages herself. The floorboards creaked beneath her, not from her weight. She wasn't moving. The assistants tightened the straps. One of them whispered that it felt like the room was getting smaller. Then the baby monitor cut the silence. Then to a voice that said Mallory's name. Not shouted, whispered. And not his voice, his father's. He didn't flinch, just turned the page, spoke louder. Tina began to laugh. That was when the mirrors, covered or not, started to rattle. Her laughter started small, a dry tickle that didn't belong to a 24-year-old woman, and it found a rhythm with the rattling so tight it was hard to tell which one was leading the other. The assistant at the foot of the bed froze with his hand on the strap, and the one near the headboard shot him a look that said don't. Just don't. But the first one had already turned toward the dresser and whispered that he could see someone standing behind the sheet, which made no sense because the sheet should have shown nothing. Mallory kept talking. He kept the Latin steady and low, like a man pushing a stalled car up a hill inch by inch, and the nuns outside answered him with the cadences of their psalms, their voices braided, thin but unbroken. And it should have been absurd in that expensive room with the oil paintings and the tasteful floral wallpaper. But it wasn't absurd at all because the temperature kept dropping while the skin on their hands turned clammy as if the humidity was rising, and the smell in the air went metallic and sharp. And Tina angled her head like she was listening to distant thunder and said, "You can turn the lights off, Father, but they don't need the light." He didn't break stride. Mallory adjusted the crucifix in his palm and shifted his weight, a fighter planting his feet, and he asked Tina, not the thing, but the woman, if she could hear him, if she wanted help, if she could tell him who had first spoken to her and when, and the hair on the back of Mallory's neck went straight up. The covered mirrors pushed outward again, a bulge the size of a face, the fabric stretching until the weave showed, and the assistant at the footboard lost count of his breaths and said, "Father," in a voice that already knew the answer wouldn't help. The bed jerked against the floor, the frame squealing, and Tina's whole body moved with it without any of the lag you get when a strap pulls a limb. Her wrists and ankles bowed against the leather as if the restraints were suggestions. And then her eyes rolled back until only whites showed, and those whites clouded like milk poured into water. And she started in on a small stream of Latin so clean it made Mallory's careful diction sound clumsy. He paused. "Tina," he said, switching to her name. "I'm here because you were loved enough to be sought out. You are not alone. You're not a mouthpiece, you're not a stage." She looked up at him with those thin, filmed-over eyes, and then passed into the dresser, and the sheet snapped flat as though a hand had fallen away. The assistant at the headboard leaned close and murmured a Hail Mary under his breath, and Tina's mouth crooked with something almost kindly before she said, "Your brother didn't pray when he did it." And the kid recoiled like he'd taken a punch, because there are things you can't know unless you were there. And he had been the one to find his brother in the garage. The exhaust choking sweet and the note on the workbench addressed to no one. And Mallory didn't look at the assistant or at Tina or at the mirrors. He fixed his eyes on the crucifix, as if the metal might run if he let it. And he brought the cross to her forehead and pressed until skin whitened under the pressure and then flushed. And then the smell that came off of her, he told me, was the smell of an old nursery rug that had soaked up a generation's worth of accidents. The sheets over the mirrors began to ripple. Not from draft, not from footsteps in the hall, but from something that understood the tension of fabric and used it, experimenting like a child pushing a swing from behind. The assistant at the footboard said, "I don't want to look. I don't want to look." "Then I will," Tina said, and she turned her head farther than the joints of a neck allow and stared straight at the draped glass. And there was a snap in the bones, a damp pop. And she didn't make a sound at the pain because it wasn't pain to her. And Mallory's voice rose again, steadying, relentless, that hammer-tap cadence that means the prayer is no longer language but force, and the nuns continued on with their psalms in the hall. The air got heavy enough that breathing felt like drinking from a clogged straw. The monitor hiccuped into a lullaby, the same tune Tina had been humming. Only the words were wrong, not English, not Latin. Something with too many consonants in the wrong places. And the lullaby slipped into a counting song and stopped at 6/10. Mallory told the assistant, whose eyes were strained, "Eyes on me." Not a harsh, but absolute. And he changed the cadence of his Latin. He moved from the opening prayers to the adjurations, the charges that don't ask so much as command. Tina began to cry, the sound dry and raw in the throat. But the tears themselves were clean and human, and for a moment, the room felt like a hospital, where someone you love is going to get better if the doctors can only find the right vein. "Help me," she said. And then the other voice came in. "She asked for help, and I answered." And Mallory slammed the cross to her sternum so hard the bed shuddered, and he answered in Latin with Christ's name like a nail through the sentence. The lights flared and dimmed, and the monitor roared back to static so loud it had shape. "Father, do we bind the jaw?" the headboard assistant said, because Tina was beginning to chew the inside of her cheek to ribbons and there was blood under her tongue, and when she saw that, she smiled again and it painted her teeth with the wrong color, and Mallory shook his head because these things loved the theater of a gag. They loved the pageantry of being treated like mad dogs, and he wanted no gifts given, no small stage offered, only the single stage of command answered by departure. He lifted the silver flask and flung holy water in an arc that caught her face, her throat, the sheets, the mirror covers, and everywhere the water landed, it hissed as if it had touched a pan pulled smoking from the oven, and Tina's body went rigid, not with pain, but with ecstasy, and she whispered, "There you are," in a voice of thanks that turned my stomach to hear. The mirror over the dresser stopped bulging. It dented inward, a concave sag as though the weight had stepped away, and the closet door mirror, which had been quiet, kicked a single muffled thud from behind the cloth, and every head turned, because every instinct makes you look at a door that something's behind, even when a better instinct would keep your eyes on the enemy you can see. Tina's fingers flexed in the straps, the tendons standing out like wires, and her eyes rolled down from the whites until the irises showed up again. Only they weren't the brown Mallory had clocked when he entered. They were a pale, drowned color, waterlogged glass marble with hairline cracks, and she focused on the ceiling and whispered, "Someone's at the window," though the window was 3 stories above ground and barred by storm shutters. Mallory didn't check. He didn't need the image in his head. Mallory didn't stop. His voice was iron in the humid, stinking air, Latin words coming steady as a metronome. Holy water arced and hissed where it struck her bare arms and face. Her skin blistered instantly, steam curling from each welt, and her eyes rolled white, snatched forward to meet his. She laughed then. It was a cavernous sound, echoing from her small throat like it came from something ancient and vast. She spoke between the laughs, her voice warping mid-syllable from a woman's to a bass rumble. The words in a language that wasn't any tongue he'd ever heard, syllables crunching together like breaking bones. Mallory pressed the crucifix back to her sternum. The reaction was immediate and violent. Her back bowed so sharply, Mallory could have sworn he heard vertebra crack. The demon screamed in a dozen voices layered at once, high and low, male and female, human and animal. One assistant's nose burst in a spray of blood. The nuns outside the door raised their voices in prayer until they were almost shouting. "She is mine," the thing bellowed. The walls themselves seemed to carry the voice. "I was there before she had breath. I will drink her last." Mallory's answer was a roar of Latin, the final adjurations of the rite, his voice raw but unwavering. And Tina's head whipped from side to side with a wet snap, her tongue lashing out, blackened and swollen. The smell in the room turned foul. Rot and sulfur. The straps began to smoke where they cut into her skin, and then she bucked again, the bed lifting off the floor and slamming back down. One of the assistants muttered a prayer through gritted teeth. The demon laughed, flecks of blood spraying Mallory's cassock. He gripped the crucifix in both hands and pressed until the metal sank against her chest, branding the flesh with its shape. A scream tore out of her, shaking the glass in the windows. The sound rose and rose. And then, silence. Heavy, suffocating. Her body collapsed into the mattress, limp. The blistered skin on her chest smoked faintly. Mallory stayed where he was, crucifix held to her skin, murmuring the final lines, each word as sharp as a blade. When it was done, he stepped back slowly. Tina's breathing was ragged, shallow, but her face, what was left of her face after the burns, was her own again. The eyes were wet, human and empty. She whispered something to Mallory only he could hear. "It's gone," Mallory said, but his voice didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like a man who'd been in the room with something older and hungrier than hell itself, and knew it might not stay gone forever. Back at the bar, Mallory stared into his empty glass for a long time before I broke the quiet. "She's alive?" I asked. He nodded once. "Alive ain't the same as free." "You think it'll come back for her?" "I think it doesn't have to. It left enough behind." I leaned on the counter, trying to read the lines in his face. "So why tell me this one?" Mallory rolled the rosary in his palm, eyes fixed on the wood grain. "Because sometimes victory just means you get to watch them breathe a little longer. And if you mistake that for saving them..." He looked up, the tiredness in his gaze heavy enough to touch. "You start lying to yourself. And the devil likes nothing more than a liar who prays." We sat in silence after that, Moses shifting in his sleep at my feet, and I thought about how many people Mallory had saved who were still carrying something they'd never be rid of. Some time went by in the silence, until Mallory broke it to tell me his final story. The snow was coming down sideways by the time Mallory pulled up to the farmhouse. The wind howled across the fields, battering the siding and rattling the eaves. Candlelight flickered in the windows, weak against the black outside. Every so often the light would vanish, swallowed by the dark, and then return, proof the power had been trying to hold on but kept losing. Inside, the air was a stale mix of ash and copper. It felt thick, Mallory said. Scratches marred the wooden hallway walls, long and deep, clawed from inside out. The father stood in the foyer, a broad man whose eyes had sunk into shadow from too many sleepless nights. His jaw set in that way men hold themselves when they run out of things to fix. The mother hovered behind him, hands twisting the hem of her sweater until threads came loose. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, and she had the tremor of someone who'd been living too close to panic for too long. "She knows you're here," the father said, voice low. He gestured down the hall. "She's been saying your name." From above us, muffled but clear, came a girl's voice. "Father Mallory," it said, sing-song. The sound didn't belong in a child's mouth. It was too even and too deliberate. The door to the room was already open and candlelight spilled into the hall. Father Mallory walked into the bedroom and the 3 assistants behind him piled in. 2 nuns flanked the far wall, lips moving in prayer. Elise lay bound to the bed, leather restraints drawn so tight that wood beneath her wrists had begun to splinter. She wasn't thrashing, but every few seconds her arms would tense, the straps creaking, as though the strength inside her was testing the limits of the bindings. Her lips moved, whispering a flow of syllables Mallory later told me was perfect Aramaic. Her eyes opened when he stepped into the room. One of the candles on the dresser hissed, a bubble forming in the wax before the glass cracked and sent hot shards to the floor. Elise didn't flinch at the sound. She just kept watching Mallory, her mouth curving into a faint, unreadable smile. "Go screw yourself, priest. You have no power over me. I have souls in this vessel you can't even conceive of," she said. Mallory ignored her voice and began checking the bindings himself. When his fingers brushed her wrist, her skin rippled like something was moving just beneath it. The assistants exchanged glances. One muttered a prayer under his breath. The nuns outside the door raised their voices, the Latin words threading into the cold air like strands of rope. Mallory didn't respond to the greeting or the taunt. He simply pulled his stole from his bag, draped it over his shoulders, and looked to the assistants. "When she starts, hold her down. Don't let go unless I tell you." He opened the book at the right, the leather worn and soft from decades of use, and began. His voice cut through the stale air, steady but edged with something raw. The first verse was met with a hiss from Elise, low at first, then swelling into a howl that made the candle flames bend away from her. Her muscles bunched, straining against the straps, and a faint cracking sound from her shoulders. The assistants leaned in, bracing her limbs. The room seemed to darken, though the candle still burned. Then she started to thrash. The bed frame groaned, the leather straps biting into her skin until blood welled. Mallory said her eyes rolled white, then snapped open with pupils like drops of ink and milk. Mallory's voice didn't falter, but the effort was in his clenched jaw, in the way each syllable landed like a hammer. She answered in a dozen voices at once. A crack rang out, her left shoulder dislocating under the strain, and the demon laughed through her screaming, through her pain, calling Mallory by his baptismal name. It taunted his fasting, it taunted his faith, and the sins he thought buried. But he pressed on, invoking Christ and the hosts of heaven, holy water arcing from his hand to hiss against her skin. The Latin grew louder, the nuns outside matching his rhythm, the whole house trembling with the battle being waged inside one breaking body. When her spine bent at an impossible angle, and her voice became a sound like grinding stone, Mallory's eyes glistened, not from fear, but from the knowledge of where this was heading. Still, he called for her soul, demanding the unclean spirit depart, even as her body began to give way beneath his violence. Her head snapped back and she screamed a single word that cracked like a rifle shot. Blood vessels burst in one assistant's eye and another spat blood. The demon roared, clawing through her throat with such force that flecks of torn tissue spotted the priest. He prayed louder, faster, his voice breaking, calling on Christ to cast this horde back into the pit. She laughed then, a deep rattling sound, and for a heartbeat. I thought Mallory might collapse while telling me this story. But Mallory drove on, hammering the Latin into the air, until the girl's body jolted once, twice, then went still. There was a silence after that. Mallory held the crucifix against her chest, eyes locked on her face. No breath came. He tried resuscitation, counting compressions, breathing for her. But each attempt was met with nothing but the steady whisper of the nun's prayers. The horde of demons had been forced to leave under the power of heaven, but it came with a price. The girl had died. When he stopped, the mother wailed. The father turned away, shoulders hunched, fists pressed to his temples. Mallory lowered his head, the crucifix still in hand, and whispered one final prayer. I kept the bar open late that night, as if the extra hour could wring the ache out of the room. Wind pushed at the door and rattled the bottles in a tired chime, and the neon beer sign in the window gave up and came back to life like it couldn't decide if it wanted to. Mallory was in the corner in his collar and overcoat, wet cuffs drying in a salt ring on the floor. Moses lay under the jukebox with his big head on his paws, watching the priest instead of sleeping. I wiped the same spot on the counter until the wood warmed under my palm, then gave in and brought the bottle over. Mallory didn't smile. He lifted his eyes, and I saw the red rim of where a man's tears had dried and decided they'd done enough damage. I lost more than a fight. I lost the one thing that makes the fight worth anything. Mallory seemed done with wine at this point, so I poured him a glass of whiskey and took one for myself. And if he'd won? If she'd lived? He didn't answer at first. He turned the glass slowly, smearing a circle of water on the table. You ever try to fix a light that keeps flickering? And you keep replacing bulbs and flipping breakers, and finally you take the fixture down and there's nothing wrong with it at all. Because the house is sinking and the wires are tearing inside the walls. You can win with a light bulb, but you can't win with a house that's already sliding off its foundation. He took a swallow and grimaced. She died with God's name in the room. If that name has power, it didn't show its face tonight. You did everything you could, I said, and it felt thin the second it left my mouth. He huffed through his nose. I did everything prescribed. Right would have been her breathing. The wind found a seam and moaned. The bar answered with a soft pop from the wood. You think it's a test? Some lesson? He shook his head once, a small tired motion. I have administered too many tests in my imagination. If God's a teacher, he's tenured and absent. Then why come here, Father? Well, why tell me? He looked at Moses as if the dog could be bribed to translate something neither of us spoke. Because you listen. Because you don't lie to me with piety. Because I can hear myself say I've lost my faith and not be handed a pamphlet and a hug. He put 2 fingers to his temple and pressed. And because I wanted to see if saying it out loud might make me feel lighter. It don't. I mean, you fasted, you prayed. I starved and talked to myself. I asked for strength and I got tremor. I asked for presence and I got echoes. He rubbed the cheap ring on his finger. Do you know the worst part, my friend? It ain't the gore. It ain't the sound of bones turning the wrong way. It's knowing a girl looked at me and wanted me to be the door out. And I opened every keyhole I was given. And the door wasn't there. He closed his eyes and let the glass touch his head like a fever compress. I spent a lifetime telling people there's a door. Maybe there is, and it's not yours to find every time. Maybe you're a man with a pry bar in a house with no doors and you still put your shoulder to the studs because what else is there to do? He laughed once without humor. The theology of pry bars, Saint Crowbar, patron of bruised shoulders. He looked past me to the bottles. You think there's a point to it? To what? Suffering? To showing up, to saying words to a room that won't listen. I thought about the furnace room and the sound of German coming out of a man who never left the country. Thought about the babysitter's jaw unhinging like a trap and the way the air felt like it had eyes. Thought about tonight, the heat in the Latin, the stories that Father Mallory had told me. If there isn't a point to showing up, then we're animals with expensive furniture, my friend. You showed up, she died. Those two truths hate each other, but they're not mutually exclusive. And I think evil's real. And I used to think grief dressed up like it. Now I think grief is just the coat it borrows. You're standing in that room with your book open. Maybe that's not a guarantee. Maybe it's a defiance. And before you came in tonight, I would have said my faith was shaky. But now, hearing your story, it's been cemented. He smiled. You would have made a frustrating seminarian. I make a frustrating everything, my friend. Ask anyone who knows me. Wind pulled at the building again. I envied certainty. I envied the ones who leave a room like that and say, God be praised, and mean it. Even if the body is cooling, I can't do it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. Then don't. Don't say the words you can't carry. Say the ones you can. He waited. I surprised myself by continuing. Say, I cared about her enough to stand there. Say I hated what was in her enough to call down to heaven, even if heaven kept me on hold. Say I am tired, and let that be a prayer the size of an ocean. What do you know about prayer? Very little. But I know about talking to people who aren't in the room and hoping they hear you. I took a drink and let it burn. It was honest. You don't have to believe tonight. You just have to sleep and wake up and decide whether to answer when the next phone rings. He flinched a little, as if the word next had teeth. There will be a next. Of course there will. The dark doesn't close shop, but you can decide if you do. I don't know what tomorrow brings. Me either. But if it brightens, we've got coffee. If it darkens, I've got the keys to the bar. He stood, and the chair legs scraped, and Moses stepped back to let him pass. At the door, he paused and looked at the cross I keep crooked over the register like a joke I forgot. You should straighten that. I think I like it crooked. It looks lived in. It shows we all have our flaws. He pulled his coat tight and opened the door into the weather. The wind came in and touched everything once and left. I watched him move into the snow, until he was just a collar and a shadow. I locked up, killed the neon, and stood in the dim with Moses until the room settled. I didn't kneel, and I didn't 1, 2, 3 myself with a sign, but I said thank you to the air like a man who just remembered a name he thought he'd lost. Then I scratched Moses behind the ear and told him we'd be open late tomorrow too, because a man might come in needing a place to put his coat. And for once, I had enough faith for two. I moved to a new town about a year ago. I was offered a job and was at a point in my life where I felt restless and eager all at once. A new job in a new town was exactly what I had been waiting for. In 2 weeks' time, after saying goodbye to my friends and family, I packed up and made the 4-hour drive to my new apartment. Turns out, it's tough to make new friends once you're out of college. I settled into the job just fine. My coworkers and daily routine both to my liking. Meeting new people was difficult though. I didn't go to church, I didn't really go out much, and I wasn't part of any club. After a couple weeks of maddening isolation, I forced myself to go to a bar, determined not to leave until I met a few locals. I'm glad I went because that's where I met Lydia. I happened to sit down next to her, and after I ordered my drink, she noticed me and smiled, commenting on my shirt. That sparked our conversation, and eventually, after a few drinks, I summoned the courage to ask her out to dinner. She said yes, and my life was suddenly exciting again. I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't spend enough time with her. She was amazing, and our date turned into 2, then 3, until finally she came over to my place for the night. In the morning, there was no question of how we felt about each other. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship only got better. We never fought. We never argued. Hell, we hardly frowned at one another. I knew that we hadn't been dating that long, but even so, everything was so perfect that I was convinced we would stay like this forever. One thing that did strike me as odd, though, was that she never wanted to spend the night at her place. We always ended up in my apartment, which was fine, but it struck me as kind of strange. I had seen her place only once, and it seemed perfectly fine. Her apartment consisted of an entire top floor of a 3-story house, fairly old but well kept. I asked her about this once or twice, suggesting we end the evening in her bed, but she always wriggled out of it. I didn't press her too much. Her excuses always mildly valid. Well, all that has changed. You see, we did end up at her place for the night. And by gosh, I wish I had listened to her. We were fairly drunk, the energy in the bar slowly winding to a dull murmur. I heard the bartender make last call, and I groggily looked at Lydia on the bar stool next to me. She gave me a tired, tipsy grin, and I asked her if she was ready to go. She said yes, and as we made our way outside, I realized that I was in no condition to drive. My car was parked behind the bar, and as we clung to each other for warmth, I voiced my concerns. She told me she was too drunk to drive as well and suggested we call an Uber. As I thought this over, I realized we were in correlation to her apartment. I told Lydia that we were only a couple blocks from it, why don't we just crash there? She seemed to be waiting for this, knowing full well how close we were. I'd only been there once, so my slogged mind had taken some time for that fact to catch up with my brain. After a long pause, she agreed, warily. It wasn't a long walk. The streets around us empty except for a few late-night stragglers. She lived pretty close to the center of town, and as we walked the brick sidewalk, I asked her how long she had lived at her place. She had said 3 years, but she was looking to move. She wanted to get a place a little quieter, a little more out in the country. I expected her to casually bring up moving in together, but she never did. After a few blocks, we arrived at her place. It was a large 3-story house with each floor rented out individually. She keyed her way into the front door, and I followed her up the flight of creaky stairs. At the very top was her door, and after glancing at me, she unlocked it and we went in. This was only the second time I had been here, and as I looked around, I wondered why. She kept it very clean and organized. In fact, it was way cleaner than my place. The furnishings were elegant and crisp, modern in style, contrasting with the older building. I commented on how nice it was and that we should spend more time here. She shrugged off my comment with a maybe, and we began to settle in for the night. It was already late, so we cleaned up in the bathroom and retired to her bedroom. As we stripped and climbed into her queen-size bed, I noticed that she had left the door open a crack. I thought that a little funny, seeing as how deliberate that action had been. I said nothing, though, and gratefully pulled the soft sheets over me. Lydia curled up next to me, casting a glance at her door, and then settled her head on my chest. I pulled her tight against me and let out a long, happy sigh. I kissed her on the head, and I could feel her body relaxing against mine. It didn't take long before the two of us were fast asleep. But it didn't last long. I jolted awake as someone pounded on the front door of her apartment. I blinked and opened my eyes in the darkness. What time was it? Who the hell was that? I reached over to the nightstand and checked my phone. It was 3:30 a.m., way too late for someone to be stopping by unannounced. I went to sit up, but Lydia clutched my body, her hands trembling against my shoulders. I looked down at her, confused as to why she wasn't letting me up. I asked her who was at the door, and she didn't answer, just held me. Another trio of knocks, and louder this time. I went to sit up again, asking her what was going on, but she looked up at me with fear in her eyes. "Don't get up," she begged. I was thoroughly confused now, her reaction puzzling me. Who was at the door? Was she keeping something from me? Was she hiding something? I wondered if this was some ex-boyfriend drunk and trying his luck. Just the thought of that made me want to get up and see who it was, size this piece of shit up. Who the hell did he think he was? Lydia was mine, and I wanted everyone to know that. I tried to pry Lydia off me, expressing my thoughts, but she shook her head, telling me it wasn't an ex. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I could tell that, regardless, she was terrified. She put her hands over her ears as another pounding on the front door echoed into her apartment. I took her face in my hands, forcing her to look up at me. I told her I needed to go see who it was. Maybe someone was in trouble. Maybe something had happened. In truth, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't some asshole ex of hers. Tears began forming in her eyes, and she looked directly at me, bottom lip quivering. "Please, do not open that door." Another loud knock as furious as the others. As I lay there, I noticed there was no yelling from the other side of the door. And typically, this late at night, a visitor would announce themselves. Mercifully, it stopped. I waited, unaware that I was holding my own breath, waiting for the pounding to continue. But it didn't. Exhaling loudly, Lydia softened against me. I could tell that whatever had just happened had been a semi-traumatic experience to her. I tried to question her, but she begged me to just let her sleep. Stuttering, I forced myself to eat the questions crawling up my throat, and instead, put a comforting arm around her. Soon I heard her breathing steady into the deep rhythm of sleep. I stared at the ceiling, and wondered what the hell had just transpired. The next day was Saturday, so neither of us had to work. We woke up late, and I felt Lydia get up and go into the kitchen. As I enjoyed the warm bed, I began to smell coffee brewing. I smiled and forced myself up. It was a pleasant morning, both of us lounging on our couch, idly chatting about what we wanted to do that day. I didn't bring up last night's incident, waiting to see if she would. It was obvious she was avoiding the subject, refusing to even acknowledge it. She seemed to be in a good mood, though, so I decided to keep my mouth shut. When she wanted to talk about it, she would. Until then, I just needed to be a good boyfriend and not press her on it. I'd be lying, though, if I didn't say every part of me was bursting with irritated curiosity. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't some lover from the past, returned for some late-night action. As we finished our coffee, it began to rain outside, and I suggested we spend the day here, catching up on our TV shows, and maybe cooking some dinner together tonight. She seemed excited and agreed immediately, much to my surprise. I went and put on another pot of coffee as she queued up our show on Netflix that we were watching together. Glancing out at the gloomy day, I smiled and snuggled up next to Lydia, ready for our lazy day together. The hours slowly went by, both of us in full binge watch mode. As episode after episode was played, the day peaked into a cloudy climax and the dark gray outside began to fade into night. Both of us hadn't moved much, perfectly content on the couch, listening to the rain and the television. After one of the episodes ended, she suggested we start making dinner. I agreed, feeling my stomach rumbling, and asked her what she wanted to make. After some discussion, we decided to try our hand out at some homemade Chinese. I turned on some music on my phone as she went to the kitchen and began pulling out ingredients. She tossed me an apron with a wink, and I laughed as I tied it around my waist. I went to her and took her in my arms, dancing her around the kitchen, lip-syncing the song that was playing. She giggled and told me I was ridiculous, but then kissed me slow in my dance. We pulled away from each other and she began assembling the food. I wasn't much help, but I kept her entertained as she worked her culinary magic. We laughed and cycled through songs, our conversation light and flirtatious. After a lot of work, the food was finally done. We took our place on the couch again, piling the delicious-smelling feast in front of us on the coffee table. I queued up another episode and she shot me a smile, telling me today had been amazing. I wholeheartedly agreed and kissed her. Then we dug in with a vengeance. Lydia had outdone herself, everything coming out perfect. I gobbled down a couple of batter-fried pieces of chicken and told her we should do this again tomorrow. She agreed, but said that she'd like to sleep in my place tonight. I cocked an eyebrow at her, swallowing my food, and asked why we wouldn't stay here. She looked at me over her bowl of lo mein and said we had been here all day, why not mix things up? I put my food down and threw an arm over the back of the couch, expressing to her how great it was here today, that we should just put a bow on it and stay here for the night. I was still in my undershirt and boxers, for goodness sake. She looked at me a little unsteadily, wanting to argue with me, but knowing she didn't have a good reason. At least that's what I thought. I could see her struggling to come up with something, anything to get us out of here tonight. Eventually, she just sighed and nodded silently. I smiled and rubbed her shoulder, telling her it was going to be great. As I turned back to my food, I wondered if her reservations about staying here had anything to do with the person at the door last night. But what did she have to be afraid of? I was here, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let anything happen to her. We finished our food and stretched out on the couch, pushing deeper into our show. Lydia lay down on top of me, and after a couple of hours in that position, I felt myself begin to drift off. I could feel Lydia doing the same, both of us surrendering to the food and the steady rain. Together, they gently lulled us to sleep. I startled awake as someone pounded on the front door. Lydia sprang up on top of me, her knee thudding into my ribs. I let out an oomph as my side spiked in pain, but she slammed her open palm down over my mouth, silencing me. Her eyes were wide and terrified, all traces of sleep gone from her face. I looked up at her, waiting for her to say something. Instead, she cowered down into me as another series of loud knocks came from her door. This is insane, I thought. Someone is clearly terrorizing my girlfriend, and she's too embarrassed or ashamed to tell me about it. I forced both of us into a sitting position despite her frantic efforts to keep me in place. I whispered to her that I was going to answer the door and put a stop to this. I told her someone was stalking her, and that after I confronted the person, I was going to call the police and put an end to it. She shook her head wildly, tears budding in her eyes. She told me that it wouldn't do any good. The police couldn't help. She tried to pull me back down on the couch, but I shook her off. Another round of pounding on the door. I told her I was going to answer it unless she told me what was going on. She bit her lip, huddled on the couch, or stretching her face. She said I couldn't answer it, begged me in hushed whispers to just wait until it went away. "Who is it? You have to tell me," I said in a soft growl, leaning close to her. She looked up into my eyes, tears staining her cheeks, and whispered, "It's the devil." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. What? What did she mean by that? 3 long knocks shook the frame of the door. I looked at my phone and saw it was a little after 3 in the morning. For a moment, I was completely frozen with indecision. I wanted to protect my girlfriend and confront this head on, but the way she was looking at me, begging me to just leave it alone, tore my mind in the other direction. Finally, I made an impulse move, taking 3 long strides to the door as more pounding erupted from the other side. Seeing me, realizing what I was doing, Lydia leaped from the couch, screaming not to open it, her eyes bulging from their sockets. As my hand found the doorknob, Lydia sprang towards me, still screaming, and grabbed my arm, jerking me back from the door. It was too late. I had turned the handle, and the door popped open a crack, letting in an empty darkness. But there was something in that darkness. Lydia shrieked and tightened her grip on me, dragging me backwards into the bedroom, her face swelling with absolute terror. She shoved me into the bedroom, screaming at me, her voice cracking. Just before she slammed the door shut, I saw something walk into the apartment, dragging shadows behind it. Lydia locked the bedroom door and leaned against it, sweating and breathing heavily. She looked at me and I saw fear in her eyes I didn't know existed. She met my gaze and slowly shook her head, unable to believe what I had done, panic dripping from every pore. I didn't know what to say. Stunned by her reaction and terror, I stood by the bed slightly shaken and confused. Something knocked hard on the bedroom door. Lydia let out a little shriek and then quickly covered her mouth. She squeezed her eyes shut, and I heard her praying quietly. I didn't know what to do. I stood there stupidly, mouth agape. Someone was in the apartment. I had seen him come in. Reality was slowly sinking in, pushing aside the confusion and filling me with the icy cold of fear. Someone had walked into her apartment and was now pounding on the bedroom door. I swallowed hard, that icy fear tickling my stomach. We could be in serious danger. I needed to call the police, but both of our cell phones were by the couch, discarded where we had fallen asleep. I had to do something. I needed to try and take control of this. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, taking Lydia by the shoulders and moving her away from the door. She fought me for a second until I assured her I wasn't going to open it. Another sharp rasp on the door. Heart racing, I pressed my ear against the wood. I didn't hear a sound between the knocks, not even breathing. Summoning my courage, I cleared my throat and asked who they were and what they wanted. A pause. I jerked back as another assault on the door rattled the hinges. I stared at Lydia, looking for guidance, hoping she had an answer to this madness. Every second that passed, I felt increasingly scared, the gravity of our position sinking deeper and deeper into my mind. It's the devil. I shook my head, disregarding the thought. That was ridiculous. An impossibility, and I wasn't going to humor it. And yet, I felt something on the other side of the door. I couldn't explain it, but it was this feeling, this weight, like there was a black hole sucking me through the wood. I suddenly heard movement from the other side, and I pressed my ear against the door once again. I didn't hear anything, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the person had left. Quietly, I got down on my hands and knees and looked under the door. A large yellow eye and black face was staring back at me from the other side. I screamed as soon as I saw it, pain rocketing through my eye socket. I fell back, clawing at my face as my vision swam and stars exploded in my skull. Lydia screamed and dropped to her knees next to me, asking what was wrong. After a few seconds, the pain receded, and I blinked back tears. Lydia just held me, terrified, and I looked at her, rubbing my eye. Her lip was quivering, and I could tell she believed what she said. That whatever was on the other side of the door, she thought it was the devil. I realized my own heart was racing, and I took a few steady, deep breaths. That eye. I shivered, not even wanting to think about it. I had never seen anything like it. The way it dilated when it saw me. The sick yellow color. What the hell was in here with us? 3 more knocks on the door. Lydia curled up into me, tears freely falling from her eyes. I was so confused and scared I just put an arm around her and stared at the bedroom door in the darkness. What was I supposed to do here? God help me, what was I supposed to do? He's come for me, Lydia wept, sobbing openly now. I told him I was his if he would just give me happiness. I was a little girl. My parents were so mean. Her big wet eyes looked up into mine. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm so sorry. She covered her face now. God never answered my prayers, and I was so sad. I just wanted to be happy, so I thought, oh, what have I done? I took her face in my hands, forcing her to look up at me. Voice shaking, I asked what the hell she was talking about. A deep seed of terror rooted in my gut. After another bone-shaking series of knocking, she told me that when she was a little girl, her parents abused her. She cried herself to sleep night after night, begging God to send an angel to save her. God didn't seem to be listening, and so finally she turned to the other side. She promised the devil that he could have her if he would only bring her happiness. 3 days later, her parents died in a car accident, and she moved in with her grandparents who loved her deeply. In the blackness of the bedroom, trapped and afraid, I listened to her story and felt nausea churn my stomach like rotten butter. As the words poured out of her mouth, I couldn't shake the image of the eye staring back at me from under the door. 3 more knocks. I jumped as the wood splintered and whatever was behind the door shifted again, a new sound entering the darkness. It sounded like something was dragging nails across the wall just outside the bedroom. Over and over again, the muted scraping sound pierced the pockets of silence. I pulled Lydia up onto the bed and sat her at the foot of it. I stood in front of her, sweat trickling down my spine, and asked her what she was talking about, asked her if it was true. She started to cry again, hands reaching out for me, but I grabbed them and pulled them to her sides. I asked her again, trying to block out the scraping sound against the wall. She nodded and said that it was true. She told me that for the past 6 months, if she was home, the knocking would start around 3 a.m. At first, she thought it was an intruder and called the police. But when they didn't find any traces of anyone at their 4 separate visits, they stopped taking her seriously. Eventually, about 2 weeks in, she remembered the deal she had made when she was a little girl. She remembered who she had made it with. I didn't know it would be this soon, she croaked, looking up at me, her face stained with tears. I shot a nervous glance at the door as the scraping sound was followed by more pounding. I forced myself to breathe. If what she was saying was true, why doesn't it just come in? What's stopping it from kicking the door in and snatching my girlfriend? I couldn't make sense of it and turned these questions on Lydia, still sobbing. She said she didn't know either. She said that whenever the knocking started, she would just wait until it stopped. Sometimes it'd be a few minutes. Other times it would last till morning. She said that she felt that it was powerless unless she opened the door and let it in. Something about the doors, the separation of victim and prey, stopped it. I didn't know if it was some supernatural reason or maybe spiritual, but either way, I was thankful for it. But now, we were trapped with no way out. We were on the top floor in the bedroom with only one window looking out on the street below. Our cell phones were out there with the thing, and we had no way of communicating with anyone from in here. Again, I didn't know what to do. My mouth was dry and hot. Shooting another glance at the door, I went to the window and looked out. And despite being in town, the streets were empty and the sky dark. I tried to open the window, but couldn't. My muscles strained as I put all my might into it, but it was no use. Lydia saw what I was trying to do and came over to help, bumbling that it should be open. It was always open. Even with the two of us, we couldn't get it to budge. Frustrated, I slammed my fist into the pane as the bedroom door shook, accompanied by more scraping across the walls. It was useless. We were trapped in here. Lydia collapsed to the floor, backing herself against the wall, covering her ears against the barrage against the door. Exhausted and terrified, I slumped down next to her. We would have to wait it out. It's still knocking. Lydia is crying in my lap. We haven't moved. It has to leave us alone. She says it always does, eventually. The sun will be up soon. The clock says it's 5 a.m. Almost there. Please let it stop. Why hasn't the sun come up yet? Something's wrong with my clock. It says it's 3 a.m. again. That can't be right. There's no one outside. There should be cars on the road, but I haven't seen a soul. God, it's knocking again. I'm so tired. Screaming and pounding on the floor hasn't done any good. No one seems to hear us up here. I still haven't seen anyone outside. I tried breaking the window, but I can't even get it to crack. Something's going on. None of this is making sense. It's still dark outside. Where's the sun? I haven't heard anything from the door in a little while. I'm praying it's over. Oh man, I'm getting hungry. I don't know how long we've been in here. Lydia is asleep on the bed. She cried herself to sleep. The knocking is back, louder than ever. I can feel it just beyond the door. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. Where is everyone? Why hasn't someone come to see what's going on? I can't take this fucking knocking anymore. Lydia's crying. She said she's thirsty. I am too. I feel like we've been in here for days. I feel like I haven't seen the sun in ages. I'm starting to wonder if anyone is going to come for us. Whatever is outside the door, I think it's bent reality around us. I think we might be stuck here. There has to be a way out, though. I fell asleep. When I woke up, Lydia had her hand on the doorknob. I yanked her away, screaming at her. I can't lose her. We're gonna get out of this. When I pulled Lydia away, the thing behind the door, the demon or devil, whatever it is, screamed at me. I have never heard such terrifying fury in all my life. God, please help us. Please. Lydia is getting sick. We're never getting out of this room unless I do something. We're both dehydrated and Lydia isn't gonna make it much longer without some water. It's knocking. Each blow crunching into my skull like a drill. Where is everyone? The clock still says 3 a.m. If there is a God, He can't see us in here. Ah, fuck this. We're dying. I need to do something. Lydia has been laying on the bed for hours. I don't remember the last time I saw her move. Should check on her, but I'm so tired. The knocking is constant now. It hasn't stopped in hours. I think I'm going insane. This is it. Lydia needs medical attention or she's gonna die within the day. It's still dark out. The clock says 3 a.m. and I feel like I'm going deaf. The constant thundering against the door of a relentless assault on my senses. I'm gonna open the door. I have to, or we're gonna die. Whatever awaits us on the other side can't be much worse than this. I have to try something. I can't just let her die. I can't. I'm going to open the door. I can hear it screaming again. It sounds excited. There's another noise behind its howls. It sounds like someone quickly flipping through radio stations. I don't know what it means. It can't be good. God, if you're out there, I could really use some help. Please save us. I'm going to open the door now. My first breath in hell tasted like iron and smoke. I opened my eyes to nothing. No sky, no ceiling, no light source. Yet I could see. Not clearly, the world around me was dim, as if lit by embers buried deep beneath the surface. The ground was cracked and uneven, carved with ancient symbols I didn't know. Heat seeped up from beneath the stone, slow and patient, as though it had all the time and eternity to cook me from the feet up. I was naked, lying face down in what felt like ash and shattered bone. My mouth was dry, my tongue was thick. When I tried to breathe, my lungs caught. I pushed myself up to my knees, and my skin was already blistering. There was no sound at first, not even the wind, just the hiss of my own shallow breath. Then, somewhere in the dark, a human scream. High, long, and cut off. I tried to stand. My legs shook beneath me. Everything hurt. There was no memory of falling asleep, no tunnel of light, no final goodbye. Just this. I reached up to touch my face. My hands were covered in soot, my left eye swollen, and I could feel glass embedded in my cheekbone. I walked. There was nowhere to go, but I had to move. To stop was to surrender. And the terrain shifted underfoot, gravel giving way to something softer and stickier. I didn't look too closely. I kept my eyes ahead, fixed on a distant ridge of jagged rock. It was the only shape that broke the horizon. I didn't know if it was miles away or just minutes. As I walked, the screaming grew louder. Not one person, but dozens, maybe hundreds. But I never saw them. The land remained empty, yet the air was full of suffering. My skin burned with every step, and I started to notice something else. An unseen pressure. Like I was being watched. Not just seen, but examined. Like every inch of me was being studied, cataloged, and weighed. I passed through a narrow canyon carved between two great slabs of black stone. The air grew colder there, not warmer. The walls of the canyon pulsed, not visually, but viscerally. My gut twisted and I hurried through. The next stretch of land was different. Rows of pillars stood in neat grids rising out of the cracked stone. They were carved from salt-colored rock, stained dark with something that looked too red to be rust. Impaled on top of each pillar was a human form. Some still moved, some twitched, some whispered. One turned its head as I passed. It had no eyes, but its mouth moved in silence. I didn't stop. There was no wind here, no time. Just that same dull red glow and the heat that came and went in waves. Like hell itself breathed. At some point, I stopped trying to understand where I was. This wasn't a dream. Dreams don't flay your feet open and split your lips from dryness. This place was real. More real than the world I left behind. I felt it in my bones. I came to a structure, if you could call it that. Not a building. Just a flat stone surface with steps leading downward into the ground. There were symbols etched into the stone, shallow and precise. I didn't recognize the language, but it made my teeth ache just to look at them. I stood there waiting for something to happen. It felt wrong to just descend, but nothing in this place felt any more right. So I went down. The stairs were narrow and slick, carved into the black rock like veins. As I descended, the air grew thick and humid. The deeper I went, the more it stank. Like sulfur. But sharper, with a metallic tang that settled on the back of my tongue. After what felt like an hour, the stairway opened into a wide chamber. And for the first time, I wasn't alone. Figures moved in the distance, hunched and staggering. Naked, broken. I couldn't tell if they were human. They dragged themselves forward in circles, some crawling with shattered limbs, others sobbing quietly, mouthing things I couldn't hear. Their skin was the color of old bruises. They didn't react to me. It was like I wasn't there. Or like they couldn't stop what they were doing. At the far end of the chamber stood a statue, towering, maybe 20 feet high. It was shaped like a man, but the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, head too narrow. The face had no eyes, just a mouth, open and waiting. Around the base of the statue were kneeling bodies, all facing inwards, heads bowed to the stone and silent. Then something moved. Not among the damned, but behind the statue. I felt the presence before I saw it. The temperature dropped fast, like heat was being pulled away, and my breath caught in my throat. A hand curled around the edge of the statue's base. Not human, too many fingers, too long, skin stretched like leather. The creature emerged slowly, impossibly tall even while crouched. Its face was a blank plane of skin, like it had been skinned alive and the flesh pulled tight over bone. No eyes, no mouth. I froze. It turned its head toward me anyway. I didn't run, I didn't scream, I just waited for it to decide if I mattered to it. It rose higher, unfolding with the patience of something that had never known haste. Its joints cracked like stones splitting, its limbs bending in ways that defied the rhythm of human anatomy. The chamber seemed to recoil from it. The kneeling bodies pressed their heads harder into the stone until their skulls split. Blood smeared the floor, but still no sound came from them. The creature took a step forward. The air grew heavy. My ribs strained as if being squeezed from the inside. The world pressed down until my knees buckled. I fell to the ground under the weight of its judgment. Then came the voice. "You walk. You are not summoned. You walk unmarked." I tried to speak, but my throat was ash. I managed only a cough. My silence was its answer. The air shifted. Something like a claw, but more deliberate, closed around my arm. The heat of its grip seared me. The creature leaned close, filling my vision. My body trembled like it was ready to tear itself apart.
You walk, then you will be carried.
I was lifted from the ground as if I weighed nothing. My ribs ground together under the pressure of its hold. The chamber bent and warped, the statue blurred. The kneeling figures collapsed lifeless in perfect unison. The wall cracked open where the creature turned its head, and a passage yawned into the darkness. It carried me inside, the stone closing behind. The walls dripped with heat and moisture. I struggled, but its grip tightened until my vision blurred white. I hung like a doll in its hand. Deeper we went. The air thickened until each breath scraped raw. Shapes shifted along the walls, faces pressed in stone, eyes open but unmoving, mouths stretched as if screaming but frozen forever. I couldn't look at them long. They disappeared into the dark as quickly as they appeared. The creature stopped before a narrow frame rising from the floor. A rack, grown from the stone itself. Without ceremony, it pressed me down onto it. Straps of living metal coiled around my arms and legs, fixing me in place. My jaw was forced open by a bar that slid into existence beneath my chin. I could breathe, but not freely. Each inhale came in a rhythm not my own. The faceless head tilted, and from the seam in its skin, something emerged. A device made of bone and thread, intricate and sharp, pulsing faintly with a lifeless energy. It set the tool against my arm. Threads burrowed under my skin with practiced ease. I tried to speak, tried to demand why, but only a rasp escaped. It tilted its head.
Because you are here, and because you are not meant to be. Not yet, at least.
The words were a blade to me, deep to my soul, into my core. The device worked deeper, peeling my skin like pages and laying them in order on the stone. I was conscious for all of it, denied the mercy of fainting, of going into shock. Every nerve obeyed, reporting its torment. My body was catalogued, measured, and reduced to data. Then, at the edge of my vision, a light flickered. White, not red. A rectangle that hummed with sound. Voices bled through it, urgent and human. A name, my name. The creature stiffened, sensing it, its voice sharpened into fury.
You do not go, you do not rise, you are kept.
The tool drove across my chest, pain flaring so brightly I saw headlights. I saw glass exploding, the wheel spinning out of my hands. In the same instant, I was back in the chamber, strapped to stone, the faceless thing looming over me. My breaths came measured. Not mine, but as if another world had seized my lungs and forced them to move. Hell bent closer, reality pressed in, and I hung between them, helpless in both. The straps did not cut and the bar at my jaw did not bruise. They simply persisted with the quiet certainty of law, and the device of bone and thread continued its work with that same silent industry, counting me, emptying me, taking notes in a ledger I could not see, and with every measured pull, I felt a thin ribbon of strength leave the arm it attended and coil into the tool as if my body had been an account kept open without my consent. Every time this needle and thread found its way into my very being, and it felt like it was threading me, my essence, into hell. The faceless being hovered over my chest. The seam in its skin held in a patient gape. And from within that vault, a breath passed over me that carried no warmth at all. Only a faint odor of cold metal, sulfur, and old ash. And when it spoke again, it did so without raising its voice, which made the words heavier rather than lighter.
Attend.
it said, and the threads burrowed deeper and spread along the line of my ribs, unhooking my skin, cataloging each layer, arranging the panels with a care that made the stones beneath my back feel varnished and clean. I tried to turn my head, and the bar allowed the attempt and then corrected it without malice. The white light returned, not as a flare at the edge of thought, but as a pane set square across the darkness. And in it there was motion. Not dream motion, but the ugly clarity of memory. A strip of wet road crawling out of blackness toward a hood. A smear of street lamps that refused to focus properly. A thread of rubber hum where a shoulder began. A warning chime I could not place. Someone spoke my name with their mouth near my ear, and the voice was the simplest thing I had heard since waking in this place. The chamber steadied. The rack steadied. The device steadied, and I watched my own chest rise and fall in a rhythm I did not set, and the pain remained until the creature placed 2 long fingers against my temple, and the white retreated a measure, not gone, only reined in like a dog taught to heel.
You are here,
it said again, not to persuade me, but to anchor me, and then a secondary phrase.
And you are observed.
And with that declaration, the work changed from survey to interrogation. A new instrument emerged from the open seam in his head. A narrow spike fashioned from the same pale material as a rack, etched with those shallow characters that made my teeth ache. The point was stained with a darkness that did not reflect light, and I knew before it touched me that the tool had been purposed beyond flesh. It slid in underneath my left eye, not blinking, not rupturing the eye, only entering. As it advanced, I felt a pressure at the rear of the socket, and then a taste at the back of my throat.
Show me,
the voices said, layered as before, and this time there was a second voice braided through the first.
Show me what you saw.
The road leapt forward, headlights cutting a low wall of rain in the segments that fought the glass. Wiper blades beating a metered prayer across a view that struggled to resolve. And my hands were on a wheel that twitched every time the tires found the shallow rivers that crossed the lanes. And the black was not pure, but full of reflections from a phone screen face down in the console, its light leaking around the edges with each small vibration. And though I did not reach for it in that instant, my mind flicked to it with the reflex of 1,000 such glances. And that flick was enough to tilt the car a degree, and the degree was enough to begin the arithmetic I had been called a moment ago. I tried to fight the memory back toward ignorance, to blur the edges, to dull the sound. The spike advanced, and resistance made it eager. The straps tightened in calm stages, neither punishing nor restraining beyond necessity, and the bar under my jaw pulsed a slow count that insisted I breathe when commanded and hold still when commanded, and learn the lesson written there. You are the subject. The device along my ribs splayed bone and numbered cartilage, then set the pieces in a tiny row in the floor, as if the room had a table and we were at it. And I watched without fainting and without the mercy of shock, because fainting and shock are only allowed in the human body. In hell, you're more than just a vessel. You are your soul. And everything, and I mean everything, is felt 1,000 times more than in the body. Back to reality, the lane markers ran out. The guardrail loomed, not as a wall to keep me, but as a ripe thing waiting for harvest. The front tire climbed and then lost purchase, and the car leapt with the same eager joy a body feels when a fever breaks, and for a second, there was a noiselessness that had nothing to do with silence, and everything to do with the failure of terms we use to describe air. And then there was the glass, exploding in shards everywhere. The glass found my face and my hands and the soft tissue around my left eye. And in that spread of particulars, a spike inside my head found a twin and sang against it, and the creature shuddered in a manner I would have called delight if delight had any place in that room.
Hold,
it said to the straps, and they obeyed.
Measure,
and the device obeyed.
Open,
it said to me, and I opened. Not kindling a lamp or lifting a latch, but letting the crash finish its reach through me until the car folded itself into the ditch and the ditch took it. And I hung a moment sideways against a harness that had not failed and yet had not been enough. And the white pain was gone, replaced by a pattern of red that pulsed without source. A horn sounded until it ran out. A distant motor passed on the roadway above without slowing. Rain entered the car and did not cool anything. Somewhere my name was tried again, first with care, then with a fear that almost looked like anger.
Again,
the creature said, and the spike withdrew a little and entered again at a new angle. And now there were images that did not belong to this night. Hands I knew, a dashboard with crumbs that had not been brushed away, a crumpled fast food bag wedged against the passenger footwell, a child's seat ghosted in the rearview mirror that had not been mine and yet insisted on being counted. And with each new detail, the voices inside my chest took notes in a grammar I could not parse, and the ledger that was me filled its lines. The pain did not crest and break. It was a tide that arrived and remained, a static condition that taught my nerves a new alphabet. And when I tried to scream, the bar turned the sound into breath, and the room refused to be impressed. The faceless head bent closer until the scene was inches from my own face, and I could see within it not a throat, but an antechamber crowded with instruments that waited with perfect patience. And as it regarded me, the register of the voice altered from judicial to possessive. A narrow hunger.
You are not writ. You are not sealed. You are not signed in the book of the left hand.
The spike rotated delicately, scoring an arc that made my left side seize.
You fell through. You walked. You were seen. You will be amended.
Somewhere behind the creature a movement scraped, not large, not near, but real. And the faceless head stilled in listening, and in the pause a thin human whisper reached me from the dark beyond the frame. A man's voice rubbed raw until the words came out, more breath than speech. Don't let it in your eyes. And the counsel arrived so late it felt like mockery, and yet it landed in me with the weight of law. Because the eye had been chosen, and the door had been opened. And there are some warnings whose only purpose is to show you when the damage became inevitable. The spike pressed farther and the pain returned, this time surging from behind the creature rather than within my head. A wash of sterile brightness that overpowered the red and reached for me with gloved hands. And the faceless head reacted at once, the seam cinching, the collar of bone blooming from its throat to clamp the back of my neck to the rack as if to shield me from a theft. And the layered voices braided into a single, furious strand.
Attend,
it commanded, and the words struck with the force of a blow. And the pain flickered but did not withdraw. A voice beyond the brightness spoke numbers in a cadence that wanted me to return and press my breath into them, while the voice above me pronounced categories that wanted me to remain and finish my being measured. And between those two instructions, a crack opened, not in the room, not in the air, but in a chain of moments I had believed was unbreakable, and I fell into and out of it and was caught by both sides. The spike found the memory it demanded, and the rack accepted the shock that followed, and the straps held their order. Then the world narrowed to a point at the center of my skull, and the point burst and everything went dark without the mercy of sleep. And the last thing I heard before the dark settled into its governance was the creature's voice. Work resumed, counting, filing, the long exact suffering that wastes nothing. And inside that order a thought appeared with the clarity of a verdict. Not yet. The straps held. The bar under my jaw pulsed its metronome. The spike waited behind my left eye like a key kept in a lock. The bone and thread device drank from my opened arm. I matched my breath to the bar until its vigilance softened, and when the faceless head leaned close enough that its cold breath lay across my lips, I took the slack the apparatus allowed and used it. I drove my forehead into the soft interior of its open seam. The sound was small. The effect was not. The seam cinched. The collar snapped at air, the spike jerked back, and for one counted beat, every strap forgot its orders. I tore my right wrist free, leaving skin on the band. I snatched the length of my own rib from the knee to ray on the floor and jammed its blunt end into the hinge of this left strap until the fibers yielded. 2 limbs loose. The bar pressed down to punish. I wedged the cartilage beneath it, twisted, cracked my jaw loose, spat blood and tooth, and broke the last band with short, ugly strokes. The room answered without roar or ceremony. The floor polished itself to a mirror and hooks grew from it like decisions, but I rolled under the rack before they fully owned their rights and came up on one knee with my breath ragged and my vision burning. Walk, the voices said, and I moved toward the place where the stones made a seam. I pressed both palms to it and insisted. The wall parted with the width of a man and I went through. It closed behind me and took a strip of skin as payment. The passage beyond had no lamps, but I could see enough to run. On my right, a channel carried a black flood, the heads surfacing at intervals to breathe what was not air before submerging and returning unmarked. On my left, the rock thinned to reveal faces pressed in stone. A wider hall admitted the moving damned, bodies revised past recognition, all speaking in a single cadence that moved faster than my feet.
Return,
the seam voice said from everywhere at once. I stopped fighting the pressure, turned my shoulder, slid through on an angle, and gained 10 paces from the seam demon while the house recalculated. The floor roughened and climbed. At a junction that offered the short path back and the long path forward, I chose the narrow fissure meant for smoke and let the stone take what it demanded. Clerk things chittered in the walls, setting bars for my anticipated step. The fissure opened onto a bridge grown from a fused spine from a creature long since gone and colossal in size. Vertebra flattened into a flexing walkway without rail. I crossed with my eyes on the next foothold. When a section buckled, I lowered my weight, spread it, waited for the structure to choose, and slid forward where it took me. A colonnade received me, each column ribbed with living ligatures that tightened and eased. Cold gathered until breath needled the throat. Between 2 shafts hung a gate without hinges. A voice spoke.
Brian, you are not sealed. You were not summoned. You are not supposed to be here. Your time is not yet up.
The floor eased toward the gate. I don't know who that voice was, but it gave me hope. The bones beneath the stones drifted to that gravity, and I set my feet and felt myself losing ground. I still held the shard of cartilage. I drove it into the seam where the gate med-whirled and twisted. The geometry faltered for the length of a breath, and I took the breath and turned it into a step, then a run. The floor leveled, the cold receded, and the voice reduced to a pressure that no longer moved the bones of my ears. I ran until the colonnade gave to raw stone, and the raw stone to a chamber hung with chains. Each chain carried a small, undecorated bell. They were still. I knew if a single tongue moved, the house would speak my position with joy. I went through them as through a nursery, slow, careful, and old for the first time since waking here. Beyond, a low arch emitted a shallow shelter where ceiling and floor nearly met. I folded there, pressed my palm to the socket, and clutched the blood-slicked shard that had been part of me an hour ago. From far back, the measured voices of the damned repeated their observation. He's trying to leave, like a ledger entry read aloud. The demon didn't hurry. Inside the dark of my good eye, the white pain brightened again, not intruding now, but arriving parallel, and a voice above it counted a pulse that did not match the bar, while another voice used my name with the expectation of an answer. Even with all the parts of me missing that the demon took, you don't die in hell. Yes, you have somewhat of a body, but you are still a soul at heart. I didn't even sleep. There is no sleep here. There is no sleep in hell. Your soul doesn't need rest. Not in eternal torment, where rest is not given. I watched my blood soak and smear with each rise of my chest. I wasn't free. I was only not held in that moment. And in that narrow difference, hope lives, quiet, untrustworthy, but alive. And while I held it with the suspicion it deserved, a pane of glass seemingly, manifested in the air before me. It was a clean light with edges, and behind it a voice counted a pulse that did not belong to hell at all, and another voice spoke my name without ceremony, not as an indictment or an inventory, but as a demand that assumed obedience. Brian, stay with me. The house that I was in hell did not accept the intrusion with grace. The air thinned, the shelter narrowed as if to deny that window of light a line of sight. Chains beyond the arch stirred without sound. I had learned to fear, a hunger without administration that announced itself by scraping its limbs along stone, not because it needed purchase, but because it wanted me to know the measure of its reach. The demon was close. I did not get to choose whether to run. The choice arrived for me as a hand that missed my shoulder and closed on the wall, leaving grooves where there had been smooth rock. I turned and saw the thing that hunted. This was no faceless minister with a ledger and a law. This one wore its appetite openly, its hide armored in pale plates that overlapped like scales forged from bone, each plate studded with embedded fragments of fingernail and tooth. Its joints articulated in nests so dense that every step offered 3 directions at once. Its head narrow and triangular, and crowded with ocelli that opened and shut as efficiently as a shutter. It walked high and then low, rearing and crouching with the same calm, the long forelimbs ending not in hands, but in tools that I remember hands and had been corrected, hooked, serrated, capable of seizing and holding and tearing in the same motion. When it exhaled, the air stank of old honey and scorched fat. It did not test me with speech. It did not try to reason with me. It crossed the chamber in 2 strides, met my attempt to pass under it with a step that put one barbed limb behind my knees and the other across my chest. It lifted me as easily as ash. The window pane of existence flared to meet the motion, and I saw the silhouette of a head and a cap bend into the light, and a hand rise with 2 fingers to feel for what it expected to find and did not. And while that hand searched my body on the real world, in a world not here, where the limb across my chest pressed down until the ribs cracked, and a thin internal whining that I recognize now as the last sound before a void began to build, the demon corrected its hold, as if I were a tool it preferred to use properly, and cradled me against its armored torso and ran. That window pane of existence back on Earth still opened. It still shined brightly, giving me sight into what was happening to my body. EMS. People trying to revive me. It faded out. Then the demon ran as if the corridors had been made to suit its length, which perhaps they were, climbing and dipping in a sequence that kept momentum without ever granting a true descent, and it did not conceal its passage because there was no need. Walls parted where it willed. Floors strengthened under its weight. And the room that had been my shelter became a pocket behind a throat, swallowed and forgotten. In an antechamber without features, it stopped and affixed me to a frame that rose from the floor. Not the careful rack of the minister from the demon before, but a rougher apparatus, built to deliver pain and punishment. A crossbar locked the shoulders, a board under the spine set to flex, a yoke that took the throat without cutting the airway and made it a handle. It did this with the speed of a crass person who has repeated a task long enough to no longer think, and it stepped back to admire it. Then it began. The first motion was a downward strike of the heel of its limb into the center of my chest, delivered not with rage, but with a measured force that depressed the bone and then allowed it to rise again and again and again, a cadence that wanted 60 to 80 in a minute and took them. A rhythm so familiar that that window pane of existence brightened before me again, and white coats crowded its edges and a gloved hand formed a seal over my mouth, and a nose and another hand squeezed a bulb and my lungs accepted air without my consent. And for a heartbeat that lasted a very long time, I understood two truths with the same clarity: that I was being compressed and ventilated in the world above, and that I was being compressed and denied breath in the world below, and that neither would ask me if I agreed. The demon did not look in my face. Its many small eyes tracked the rise of my chest as if it were watching a bellows, and when the rise did not satisfy, it altered the depth without apparent effort, driving the board beneath me to flex, my spine bowing, my ribs protesting, trying to keep my lungs from inhaling. And somewhere inside the pain, a part of me counted with the other voice, the one that spoke numbers in a calm that did not belong here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. And on the fifth compression in hell, a hand squeezed a bag up there on the earth, and on the 10th, a second hand took over the compressions there, while a barbed limb replaced a wedge here, and the two met in the center of me like disputing jurisdictions. The memory that the minister had wanted now unfolded in full without the spike to guide it. The road returned, not in fragments, but as a long coil of wet blackness and sporadic light. The phone screen that had bled around its edges earlier now turned full face up and glowing with a name I did not need to see to understand. The sound of an alert that had no business meaning more than the work of the wheel. My eyes flicking for a fraction that cost more than I earned. The right tire catching the slick lip where asphalt gave to gravel. The weight shift that starts everything and it pretends to be a correction. The rail ahead not a wall but an invitation. I tried to turn the memory away, and the demon pressed with its heel to remind me that this effort belonged to it now. And up there someone said my name again with irritation and fear braided together. And here the yoke tightened to keep the throat within reach. When the first shock came up there, I felt it down here. Not as electricity, no current travels this stone, but as a seizure of time that pulled every motion tight and then let it go. The demon froze with its heel in the air, and the small eyes opened and shut in a random scatter, and the yoke bit down, and the board flexed in a single hard bend. And the window plane of existence flashed, and a voice said, "Clear." And another said, "Shock delivered." And the monitor declared a flat refusal to be encouraged. And the heel descended when the rhythm resumed, deeper and angrier in its precision. I did not know when I began to speak. I heard my voice before I recognized it as mine, asking a question that did not belong to this room or that apparatus or the panes of the rails. Why me? Not as innocence, not as a plea, but as a poor attempt to understand aim. And the demon ignored the words because it cared not for explanations. It cared for possession, and possession does not condescend to reason. Instead, it changed implements and drew out from behind its body a tongue of dark metal that steamed in the air and pressed it across the notches of my ribs, and to listen to the sound those notches made when heated, and above a nurse said, "Bag 'em," and the bulb squeezed and my lungs took air they had not earned. The room around us changed without moving, which is to say its law shifted. A wind that had no origin pressed from the ministerial corridors through this rough chamber like an argument, and the bells I had threaded earlier rang without hands. And from the threshold of the antechamber, a voice that had once measured and now counted narrowed to a single score. It called across to the hunter without looking to me at all. "Return it." The hunter pretended not to hear and drove its heel again, and the pain flared until the light hurt even a dead eye, and the world above thinned the barrier with the sound of tires grinding gravel and an engine ticking as it cooled, and a man in a uniform swearing under his breath because my pulse would not present itself.
"It's not fair,"
the hunter screamed, and its voice was many discordant notes crushed together, insect and man and metal abused, the words dragging across the throats until they found one we both understood.
"He's mine."
And the light answered with gloves and paste and pads and a command for quiet that no one obeyed because a heart ignores decorum when it chooses. And the heel struck and the board bent, and the bag filled my lungs and a tube slid against my tongue and the world tried to choose. I called out to God. One of the few words I even uttered down in hell. I called out to him. I called out to Jesus. I called out for help. A moment passed, just a moment, and the most brilliant light of warmth and love burst into the room. A hand bigger and more beautiful than I can ever comprehend came into the room, tossed the demon aside with a flick, and picked me up in its loving embrace. The window pane of existence flashed before me again. We got something," and another said, "charging to 200. And the numbers felt like psalms spoken under breath at the edge of a war, and the pane widened until I could see the ceiling of a vehicle, and straps that were not demonic at all, and a light meant for healing. And the hunter howled a grievance that shook dust from the stone.
"He's mine,"
it said again, breaking the sentence across its own teeth. And the voice replied in the same patient register it used to name me. "He is writ elsewhere." And to hear that pronouncement with my name somewhere in its shadow was the strangest mercy I had ever known. He was only meant to see, not meant to stay. The hand lifted me up. It lifted me up and up and up until I could register it no more. There was no fade. There was a break. Heat left without negotiation. Love that enveloped me in more ways than I can ever put to words. Cold brightness flooded. The collar's pressure fell away, and the board under my back became plastic, and straps that had not grown out of stone but stitched from fabric settled across my shoulders and broke free. And the first sound that meant life stuttered into the room. A coarse rhythm on a screen that someone called out as a number, and then guarded like a candle in the wind. I coughed around an airway that had been placed while I belonged to someone else and tasted antiseptic and copper, the way you can tell when a rainstorm's about to hit. Hands held me, but not in a negative way. It was compassionate and calm. And a voice near my ear said, "Brian, stay with me." And another voice counted compressions even as my chest began to rise on its own because the habit of forcing breath outlasts the need for it by a few beats. Doors banged, a ramp lifted. Fluorescent light pinned me to the present. The vehicle lurched and steadied, and a siren's wail did what it always does, which is nothing to the dead and everything to the living. And I felt each squeal of the tires along the frame patted beneath me, and understood in that mechanical translation that the world had its own cruel ways that were aimed at last toward keeping. In the emergency room, the sound widened into a whole choir of useful noise. Overhead tones, curtain rings, metal trays. The clipped exchange of people who do not need to raise their voices to command time. I watched gloved hands peel away tape that had been laid in a different jurisdiction and replace it with their own. Watched a syringe crack its cap and feed a clear line. Watched a pen light strike my left eye and held my body still when every nerve wanted to recoil from that familiar intrusion. Hell did not vanish right away. It retreated to the edges and wore the shapes of the room for a while. A seam in a curtain that looked too much like a fault in rock. The curve of a ceiling track that remembered hooks. The shadow in the corner that had the patience of... Once, like a draft under a door, the hunter's grievance returned, thin now. A voice carried down a long stone hall. He's mine. No decree answered it aloud this time. There was only a cooling at my left ear, and the sense of an entry in a ledger that did not allow argument. A physician bent into the frame of me, eyes clear, face open with the professional distance that is its own kind of compassion. "Brian, can you hear me?" I could. And the nod I gave cost more than speech and brought more than an essay. He touched my wrist where a pulse should be and found it. Pressed the diaphragm of a stethoscope against my ribs that ached from good violence and listened hard enough that his own breath stopped. Shone the light again and watched the pupil answer with annoyance rather than fear. A man with Middle Eastern tan bronze skin and long hair stood next to me. A gray beard. A halo of light surrounding him. So beautiful. It was hard to look at, but impossible to look away. He squeezed my hand and said my name like it belonged to me again and to him. Then the purge. Because the body, when it returns, throws off what trying to keep it. I retched around the adjunct and tears ran without permission and a shudder went through me that rattled the rails, and no one scolded and no one turned away, and even that was a mercy. And no one saw the man who held my hand and said my name. No one but me. The room found its slower machinery. The steady nag of the monitor. A drip ticking through its chamber, voices dropping to working quiet. The beautiful man next to me gave me a smile and a nod. And he slowly began to fade away. But his love didn't. It stayed with me. I looked at the band on my wrist and saw my name spelled right and the date printed in a font that did not judge me. I drew a breath that was mine from start to finish, and it hurt and I kept it. The sedation brushed past, and I refused to follow it all the way down, guarding the doorway of my mind, because some part of me remembered a collar that could close without warning. And instead of sleep, I took inventory. 10 fingers and moved when told. Toes that answered late but answered. A throat that swallowed because I willed it, not because a bag demanded it. All my ribs were there, all my skin. A nurse dimmed the light and said the sentence you cannot hear down there because truth is contraband. You're safe. And it landed. I formed one word in my head. I held it there until it stopped being a thought and became a vow. Enough. not shouted. Enough of the glances that buy you a fraction and cost you a life. Enough of the small thefts that add to a large sum, larger than you meant to owe. Enough of the sliding that calls itself lucky and is only practice for falling. The ribs hurt. The air tasted like placid and salvation. I would change my life. I would dedicate it to God. The work would start while it still hurt. Because if I waited for comfort, the house below would have its say again. And I have no interest in being summoned there a second time. I'll have faith in His Son and the many rooms He has prepared for us. I close my eyes, not to surrender, but to hold on to what I have been given without dropping it. My name is Luke, and if you're listening to this, then maybe you'll understand why a sane man would ever agree to let strangers hunt him for money. I never thought my life would come to that kind of choice. But sickness has a way of forcing your hand. My daughter, Emma, is 8 years old and the best part of me. Her laugh is the only thing that keeps my head above water most days. A sudden illness put her in the hospital 3 months ago. The doctors explained it in a blur of medical jargon, but the bottom line was clear. Treatment existed, it might save her life, and it cost more money than I could ever hope to scrape together in a lifetime of honest work. Her mother passed years ago, so it's just me and my mom keeping things together, and the truth is, we've been sinking fast. I work when I can, but every paycheck gets eaten alive by hospital bills. Debt collectors started calling, and I'd begun ignoring unknown numbers altogether. The thing about desperation is it makes you look in places you normally dismiss as ridiculous. I spent late nights scrolling, typing questions I never thought I'd put into a search engine. Fast money for medical bills. Legal cash fast, no questions asked. Extreme survival payouts. Most results were scams, loan sharks or worse. But buried in an old forum about urban legends, I found a thread titled, The Hunt. At first I laughed it off. The story sounded absurd. Rich families who paid ordinary people to let themselves be hunted like wild game. The thread was full of speculation, and people calling it a creepypasta or myth. But the longer I read, the more my stomach tightened. Some posters swore up and down they knew men who walked away with money in their accounts, real money. Others told stories of people who never came back. That was the most common output. I should have closed the laptop and gone to bed, but I didn't. I read every word, then followed the breadcrumb trail to a hidden board. Nothing fancy, just text and bare bones interface. The kind of place that feels like you'll get a knock on your door the second you click submit. There were rules, clear and simple. 48 hours, armed with nothing but a knife and supplies. Survive, and the money is yours. Lose, and your body is never found. One post ended with, "They're not liars and they're not cheats. They hunt like gentlemen. If you live, you live." For 2 nights I wrestled with the idea. I didn't sleep much. I'd stare at Emma curled up under her blankets in the hospital, a plastic tube taped to her small hand, and I'd tell myself I was crazy for even thinking about it. But crazy or not, nothing else was going to buy her time. So I typed a message, short and blunt. "I'll do it. Tell me where." I expected silence. Maybe some scammer asking for banking details, but instead the reply came within hours. If you want it bad enough, you'll come. Coordinates attached. The money is guaranteed. I told my mother I'd found extra work out of state. She looked at me with tired eyes but didn't ask questions. Pretty sure she knew I was lying, but she also knew better than to push. I'd make money where I needed to. The next day I packed my old duffel with a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and not much else. I left my phone at home. Didn't want to bring it with me. The drive north stretched forever. The further I went, the less civilization I saw. Gas stations grew sparse, and by the time I hit the mountains, the sky had turned the color of steel. Pines closed in on both sides of the road, tall, dark, and leaning like silent judges. I drove with the window cracked, listening to the wind scrape against the glass. All the while I argued with myself. Was this real? Was I walking into a scam? Or worse, a slaughterhouse that nobody walked away from? Every few miles I'd think about turning around. Then I'd pictured Emma's smile and her voice saying, "Daddy, you'll fix it, right?" And I gripped the wheel tighter and keep going. At one point I pulled over on the shoulder, killed the engine, and sat there in silence. My breath fogged the windshield, and I stared at my own reflection. I tried to imagine what kind of men I was about to meet. Men with money so old they never had to lift a finger in their lives. Men who hunted lions and elephants until they got bored and turned to something harder, something more unpredictable. What kind of people could smile at dinner with the man they planned to kill in the morning? I asked myself that question over and over, and the only answer I could come up with was, the kind who can afford to. Night fell before I reached the coordinates. The last stretch of road was gravel, winding up into the thick timberland. My headlights carved tunnels through the dark, catching glimpses of deer eyes and the occasional twisted stump that looked like a crouching figure until I blinked. The address wasn't an address at all, just numbers that led me deeper and deeper into nowhere. Good thing I had a map. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees broke enough to show me a faint glow ahead. A cabin, large and sprawling, with smoke drifting from its chimney. The kind of cabin you'd expect to see in a magazine, not hidden out here in the woods. My stomach knotted so tight I thought I might throw up. I pulled into the clearing and shut off the engine. For a long moment I sat there gripping the wheel, the silence of the forest pressing in. Then I whispered out loud, just to hear my own voice, "For Emma. You're doing this for Emma." When I finally stepped out of the car, the air hit me cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke. I heard laughter from inside the cabin, men's voices deep and easy, like they had not a care in the world. It was a kind of sound that should have been comforting, but instead chilled me straight through. I adjusted the strap on my duffel and walked toward the porch light, every step feeling heavier than the last. That was the beginning of it all. I was there and there was no turning back. The door opened before I could knock. Warm light spilled across the porch boards and a man filled the frame like a cut of timber. Square shoulders, weathered face, eyes the color of green glass. He wore a collarless white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms and a vest that might have been hand-stitched a generation ago. No pretense, no jewelry beyond a plain gold band. He took me in without rushing, a farmer's survey, the boots, the tired posture, the duffel, the set to my jaw, as if weighing the yield of a field after a dry season. "Ah, you'd be Luke," he said, voice low and even, molasses over gravel. "Name's Colton." He didn't offer a last name and didn't need to. He stepped back and held the door wider. "Come on in, out the cold. The fire's going." The first thing that hit me was the smell. Wood smoke, leather, pine sap. something savory from a kitchen I couldn't see, a vaulted ceiling arched overhead with beams blackened by time. The walls were paneled in old-growth fir, warm and honeyed, and bristled with the history of 100 hunts. Mounted heads, elk and blacktail, and a boar with tusks like ivory sickles. But also framed maps crosshatched in pencil, racks of weathered rifles above a stone fireplace, and a long board with nicked edges leaned casually in a corner like someone had surfed the river between snows. A portrait hung above the mantel. A severe man with a Civil War beard and eyes that seemed to have picked a spot on the horizon and never looked away. 3 younger men stood scattered around the great room, each turning as I entered. The first was tall and wide-shouldered, a handsome raw-boned sword with a scar furrowing one eyebrow and a grin that felt like the beginning of a dare. He wore a belt knife for decoration and radiated the happy impatience of a man who wanted something to start. The second was leaner, watchful, arms crossed, his expression neither welcome nor warning. He studied me the way I'd seen EMTs study accident scenes, assembling routes and outcomes already in his head. The third, younger by a few years, had the rounder face of a kid not long out of high school, eagerness crowding restraint. His hands were restless on a baseball cap he twisted by the bill. "All right," Colton said, tipping his head toward the big one. "That's Duke." The watcher gave me a single nod. "And Tom, he'll be our runner for the hunt." I lifted a hand by reflex. "Luke," I said, and hated how small my voice sounded in that room. Colton closed the door behind me. The wind muffled and the fire found my face. The tension in my shoulders didn't leave, but it loosened half a notch. Colton gestured toward the hearth. "Warm yourself. Supper's near. We talk business at the table. Before that, there's a thing we do." He crossed to the portrait over the mantel and rested his fingers on the frame. "My great-great-granddaddy Harlan brought us out of cotton and into timber before the wool's ashes were even cold. Knew the land would outlast the flags. He was a hunter by temperament, a steward by necessity. Believed the man ought to know exactly what he is. You stand here a minute. You ask yourself that same honest question." I didn't want ceremony. I didn't want any part of whatever this was beyond the promise at the end of it. But I found myself facing the portrait, the heat on my back, and the old man's painted eyes leveled at me. "What are you? A father? Liar? Coward? Resourceful? Broke?" The words flickered through me like the shadow of branches on a windshield. Somewhere in that mess, quieter than the others, was a survivor. I didn't know if it was a truth or something I was rehearsing to make it true. When I glanced away, Colton was watching me, not unkindly. "That'll do. Come on, let's sit at the table," he said, and clapped his hands once. The dining room was all long lines and quiet money. A slab of oak ran the length of it, thick as a butcher's block, the surface pocked with the scratches of 100 knives and the ghost rings of 1,000 glasses. Lamps burned warm in tin shades. The chains were heavy, carved with a patience I didn't have in me. On the walls hung sepia photographs, men in wool coats with rifles on their laps, rivers behind them as wide as pews, dogs at their boots looking proud and tired. There were women in some of the photos too, stern and lovely, standing on porches with babies on their hips. Whatever else this family was, it had roots. We sat. Clay folded himself into a chair like a man taking a throne and thumped a fist near his plate, the scar in his eyebrow pulling when he grinned at me. Duke pulled his chair out without scraping, quiet as snowfall. Tom hovered, then slid in at the end, where he could jump up if anyone wanted anything. Colton took the head and poured wine from a dark bottle without asking who drank and who didn't. When he slid a glass my way, I shook my head. Suit yourself. To the table that holds, the roof that keeps, and the hunt that honors. Glass met glass, a low music that hinted at many such toasts before this one. I lifted my water and made the motion, because refusing it felt wrong. Food came from the kitchen on big platters. Venison roasted to blushing, root vegetables glazed to sweetness, a skillet cornbread with a delicious crust. My stomach nodded with hunger and tension, and I ate carefully, as if chewing too fast would make me an animal. Around the first bites, Colton set his glass down and folded his hands like a schoolmaster. Luke, you know why you're here. We know why you're here. But knowing a thing and speaking it are plain and different. So I'm gonna speak it plain, and you can stop me anywhere with a question. I nodded. Our people been hunters longer than we've been rich. Back when Harlan was trading cut timber for railroad bonds, his money was a fence that kept wolves out and responsibility in. He had sons with too much time and courage, and he knew idle hands don't build. They break. He'd take 'em out into the timber with nothing but a blade and a sack and tell 'em, follow, and if you can't, find your own way home. That was the first curriculum in our school, and some didn't pass. He glanced at the portraits. We mourned them, same as any family mourns their dead. But the lesson held. You respect the land, you respect the rules, and you respect the thing you're chasing. Duke set his fork down, aligning it with his knife like a ritual. Respect don't mean pity. His voice was soft, but it carried. It means fair. Colton tilted his head in agreement and went on. After Harlan, after his boys, came the years every great fortune has. The years it might end. Markets tumble, governments wobble, droughts skip like stones. We made it through because we invested like farmers plant. Diversified, patient, and always a field in beans if the corn fails. But one thing never moved. Every year, when the men of age gathered, they kept the hunt. Fox when there was fox, boar when there was boar, elk when there was elk. Then one year, this was Colson's time, my great-granddaddy, the game changed almost by accident. A drifter wintering near the mill got caught stealing. Colson could have run him out or put him in the ground. Instead, the man offered a bargain. Let me earn my keep the only way I know how, the man said. He'd been a scout in the territories, knew the woods like scripture. Colson set the terms, the man agreed, and 2 days later, he sat at this table with meat on his plate and a ledger with his name in it and money in his pocket to start over. He came back the next year, not for want, but for pride. Clay snorted, a fond sound. Old stories, he said, but the way he said it told me he'd grown up on them. One became two, two became tradition. Colton nodded. We wrote the rules down when we learned rules keep people honest. We tied into them when we learned men will exploit daylight if you leave a crack. We never hunted a man who didn't agree. We never reneged on money or mercy. And if a man makes it to daybreak on the second day, he's nobody's prey anymore. He's a guest who earned his supper in his way. That's the whole of it. And if he doesn't? Colton didn't blink. We bury with a name, not a number. We send something home if there's a home to send to. We carry the weight. We don't speak on it to outsiders. We aren't butchers, Luke. We are hunters. If that takes explaining, then the explaining won't help. 'Cause there is nothing like the thrill of a hunt. When the thing can hunt you back, when it can reason. There's nothing like the hunt of a man. He let that sit, then leaned back. Now, terms are as you were told. 48 hours. You get a K-bar knife, a flashlight that'll laugh at the rain, and a canteen. You get a 2-hour head start at first light. You can move anywhere inside the North Tract. Tom will show you the map boundaries after we eat, although I doubt you'll reach any of them. We get quite a bit of land. There's a siren at the lodge and speakers scattered throughout. You'll hear them at dawn and at the finish. When the finish sounds at second daybreak, that's it. Hunt. It becomes hospitality again. Clay grinned over his cup. And hospitality in this house is a sight better than most motels you've stayed in. Tom, eager to be useful, broke in. There's caches out there, too. Water drops, first aid. Not many, and we don't put 'em where a man can just follow a line of breadcrumbs. But we ain't trying to freeze you to death, either. Weather stays clear and cold. Trail cameras only on the boundary lines, mostly to keep you from wandering onto a logging road where some drunk with a side-by-side might run you over. He flushed when Duke cut him a look. Sorry, I didn't mean to speak out of turn. It's fine, Colton said. Knowledge makes a fairer field. He turned back to me. We hunt with what we brought into this world. Our legs, our lungs, our wits, sometimes a blade if the day calls for it. There will be rifles in our hands at times, the same as we carry them after elk. But a rifle ain't a magic wand in these trees. A man who knows how to move can make a rifle not worth 2 nickels. You run, you hide, you throw us off, we'll respect the work. You square up, we'll meet you as you wish. But we don't play with our food, and we don't make a show out of suffering. If anybody in this house ever enjoyed that, he wouldn't be in this house long. I chewed, swallowed, and wiped my mouth. The money, I said, because the word was a cliff I had to step off or I'd stand on the edge forever. You said it hits up front? Colton dabbed the corner of his mouth, the cloth napkin like he'd been born with one in his pocket. It does. We wire on your arrival. Not a promise, not a deposit. The whole of it. You'll come with me to the office after we're done here and use the phone. Call whoever you trust to check your account. I don't mind you making calls. You can call your banker and you can call your preacher if it makes it easier in your skin. Once you hear it's done, we expect you to sleep here under our roof and rise at the siren. If you run tonight, I won't chase you, but I would be disappointed in you as a man. Clay laughed big and genuine. Don't worry, Luke. Folks who get the itch to run at night usually get 10 minutes down the lane before they realize there's more eyes in these woods than just ours. Duke shot him a look, and the grin faded to a half-smile. Kidding? I'll make the call, I said. My voice steadied a little, like a man getting his sea legs. I left my phone at home. Good sense, Duke said, surprising me. We ate. The talk shifted to weather, to snowpack in the high country, to the year the river jumped its banks and took a corner of the lower pasture with it. Clay told a story about a bull elk that had treed him in a wallow and snapped the stock off his favorite rifle with a single toss of his head. Tom laughed too loud and covered it with a cough. Duke said little, but his silence didn't feel like judgment so much as inventory. He was studying. I answered when spoken to and concentrated on keeping my fork steady. Supper ended the way I suspected suppers had ended here for generations. Plates cleared, coffee poured, whiskey flowed, business resumed. Colton stood, and we stood with him because it felt wrong not to. He was the patriarch, after all. He led me down a hallway past a case of old knives, their blades dark as river rock from 1,000 honings, into a study paneled in darker wood. Here, the lodge shed its wilderness skin and put on the quiet suit of a bank. A desk big enough to land a plane on. Boots in ranks behind glass. Titles and gilt that ran from botany to ballistic. An old map of the family land drawn by hand with distances marked by the stride. A brass lamp cast a circle of light that showed dust motes afloat like snow. Colton set a leather folio on the desk and opened it to a sheet with neat columns. Last thing between us and the hunt. Read. The rules were what he'd said, but seeing them in print, which was actually fountain pen ink, I realized, gave them the solidity of a notarized will. 48 hours, siren to siren, 2-hour head start. No pursuit outside the boundary marked by the red blaze trees and the old wire fence. No vehicles in the field once the siren sounded, save for medical retrieval by Tom if required. No poison, no dogs. No fire set by either party. Caches permitted for water and basic aid, but not for weapons. If I survived, the money was mine. I would not be pursued or contacted again unless I initiated contact. If I died, they would notify the person I named and get my remains to ground with dignity at their expense. All anonymously, though, of course. There was nothing about games or cruelty. I signed. My hand didn't shake as much as I expected. Colton took the sheet, slid it into the folio, and nodded toward the phone on the desk. It had a cord. The sight of it made me feel like I'd stepped through a trapdoor in time. The dial-out code is 9. Take your time. I called my mother. It rang 3 times, and I thought she'd let it go to the machine, the way she did when the bill collectors hounded us. But she picked up on the 4th, and I said my name. I told her I needed her to log into my bank, to read me the number at the top of the page, and to do it right now. Yes, I'd explain. No, I couldn't explain just yet. I listened to the shuffle of her steps, the creak of her chair, and the sound of keys like sleet. She read the number. It wasn't a number that belonged in our life. It wasn't a number that had belonged in any life I'd lived up to till now. The amount had commas in places I'd only ever seen in ads for Powerball winners. My knees went a little watery and I sat without remembering. I told her I loved her, that she should not tell anyone anything, and that I'd be home soon. She tried to question me, but I hung up. The money was real. The trap had sprung and closed around me, except the trap was something I'd willingly walked into. There was a brief, treacherous part of me that thought, you could get in your car and drive until the needle points home. But I'd signed. And I'm sure they'd find a way to get the money back. Or find me. And I had said I was a certain kind of man in front of a harlot's painted eyes. Colton walked in, and he must have seen the swirl in my face because he didn't push words into it. He poured a coffee into a thick white mug and handed it to me, cream already folded into the color of dirt road dust. "All right," he said after a while. "Let's get your gear." He led me to a mudroom where coats hung like skinned animals, and boots lined the wall in sizes that would fit 3 generations of men. On a bench sat 3 objects: a K-bar knife in a worn leather sheath, a compact flashlight with a metal body and a rubberized switch, and a green canteen with a screw cap tethered by a loop paracord. Beside them was a folded topographical map sealed in plastic. "That blade's seen honest work. It'll serve you if you respect it. That light ain't gonna run out on you, so use it however much you want. The canteen's clean. You'll find water, but not where you want it when you want it. So think like tomorrow's you is a stranger you're trying to help." He tapped the map. "This here is your map for the topography of the land." "What happens if I hurt one of you?" The words were out before I decided whether to ask them. Colton's answer was simple. "We go home and get stitched same as you would. You won't catch us whining about a thing we volunteered to do. We expect you to defend yourself. We are also putting our lives on the hunt, so you do what you need to do." The boys came up. Duke added, "You'll buy yourself a time if you make a mess of one of us. It won't make you a hero, but it'll be good. For you." Tom swallowed. I'm the one who comes if someone's bleeding too bad to walk. You wave both hands if you want me to stop. I ain't armed when I do that. It ain't part of the game. Clay, Duke, and my father are the ones who hunt. I'm the support." There was an awkwardness at the edges of his words that made him feel a human in a way the others didn't. I nodded and picked up the knife. It fit in my hand like a tool I'd used long ago and forgotten about. I clipped the flashlight to my belt and slung the canteen strap wires to it so it wouldn't thump when I ran. Colton checked his watch and window. "You'll sleep in the north guest room. Door locks from the inside. Windows don't. That ain't a threat, it's just the way this old house is built. If your mind gets noisy, walk the hall. Nobody here is interested in spooking you. We want you strong tomorrow. A good hunt is a fair fight conducted at distance by gentlemen who know where their feet are. Anything else is a circus." He smiled, a tired, surprising smile that put 20 years on his face. "I like a circus from time to time, but I prefer it in town." He left me with Tom to show me the boundaries on the map one more time and to give me an overall topography of the land. So what do you like to go by, man?" "Luke is fine," I said. "You from here?" "All my life." He smiled, small but proud. "Went off to college a couple of years. Came back. Some things I thought I needed to see weren't what I needed. Some things folks here told me I'd miss. And I missed them." He folded the map. "You'll be fine. If you're meant to be." Back in the great room, Clay and Duke were cleaning their plates with the last pieces of cornbread. Clay looked up at me with a spark in his eyes. "You move like a runner. You ever chase something you couldn't see?" "Debt," I said before I could stop myself. Clay hooted. Duke's mouth twitched, and even Colton let out a quiet breath that might have been amusement. "Get your rest, kid. Tom, see him upstairs." Tom took me to the guest room by the particular quiet that sits around rooms not much used. The bed was heavy and old but comfortable, the kind of mattress you sink into. The window looked north, and in the glass I saw the reflection of the portrait from the hall, Harlan's eyes softened by distance and lamp glow. I set the knife on the nightstand within reach, the flashlight beside it, the canteen on the floor. I washed my face in a porcelain basin that looked older than my estate and stared too long at myself in the mirror afterward. Sleep didn't come quick, but it did come, and when it broke, it did so cleanly. I woke before the siren, blackness still pooled in the corners of the room, and the cold in the floorboards coming up through the soles of my feet. I dressed without turning on a light, hands remembering where I'd laid everything. Down the hall, the house that made the sounds old houses make before dawn. Wood settling, a pipe knocking far away. In the kitchen, a coffee pot steamed on a stove that had outlived 3 presidents. Colton stood with his back to me, reading something by the light of a single lamp. He turned at my steps and handed me a mug. You got what you need? He asked. I nodded. He studied me for a moment with a frankness that would have been rude from anyone else. Don't set yourself in a hole you can't climb out of just to feel brave. A coward dies long before a brave man does, and bravery ain't dying. It's living through what doesn't want you to. Remember that when your blood starts quickening. He set his cup down, and the sound was the smallest, most ordinary sound in the world. Clay and Duke came in, all business now. The boys from last night were gone. In their place were hunters curated down to tools and tendencies. Clay tightened the strap on a sheath at his hip and rolled his shoulders like a boxer sighting a bell. Duke checked the sights on a rifle and then snapped the cover shut, the motion neat as a folded sheet. We walked out into the brittle pre-dawn. The sky was the color of a bruise dying to yellow at the edges. Somewhere far off, a creek talked to itself like an old man. Colton walked me to the edge of the clearing where our path threaded into the trees like a vein. He took a breath of the air like a man tasting something he loved. 2 hours from the siren. You'll hear it once long. That's your cue. We'll eat. We'll give you your head start, and we'll follow at our own leisure. Move how you need to. He held out his hand. I took it. His grip was dry and firm and real. Good luck, Luke. He used my name like we were on the same side of something. I would have asked for breakfast, but my stomach, I was twisted in a knot, so I don't think I could eat if I tried. He stepped back. The world held its breath. Somewhere on the roof line, a speaker woke with a faint tick. I thought of Emma, of her hand in mine, of the number my mother had read to me like a stranger's phone number I might need to repeat back at the DMV. I breathed in pine and cold and wood smoke. The siren lifted its throat and sang a long, single, clean note across the trees. I ran. The first rule of running in timber is that running will get you killed if you don't respect the ground. I didn't sprint so much as unspool into the trees, keeping my feet under me, letting the path choose me as I chose it. I counted in my head without meaning to. 1 minute, 2, 3, then quit. The map Tom had shown me was still bright in my mind. I aimed northeast to keep the rising sun on my right like a compass you can't drop, and angled for the low saddle that would put me behind Bannertop, without forcing me to skyline myself on the ridge. Fallen fir needles made the trail soft in places, then treacherous in others where the hillside switched to shale that slid under your weight like plates on a tablecloth. The woods woke in the hour after the siren. Birds sung, and a woodpecker ratcheted its beak against a rotten trunk like a carpenter making hay of the morning. Colton's words about not skylining wasn't news, but it was good to hear the rules said aloud. Men who don't know it die on ridges where the horizon makes them a paper target. I kept the benches and shadowed sides, crossed open places only when the brush made staying low slower than the risk of being seen. And every time I stepped out from the cover I felt naked. A buck foolish in a meadow that promised nothing good except speed. Behind me, somewhere far and thin, a single shot popped like a knuckle. It was from the lodge or near it, not for me. I pictured Clay or Duke putting a round into a stump to clear a stubborn chamber or to wake the rust out of the barrel. The sound hooked something primitive in me anyway. That deep animal that knows what the crack of thunder feels like when it travels inside the skin, through the body. I kept moving. Confidence wasn't a thing you were given, it was a thing you took. Mine started as a pebble in my mouth and grew enough to chew. By mid-morning, the cold had burned off my fingers and the ache in my legs had settled into a companionship. I climbed to a bench covered in sword ferns and took my first long drink. The canteen made a hollow sound afterward that felt like a scold. I reminded myself of Tom's map and the blue marks he tapped with his finger. Possible water, but not promised. The first cache ought to be somewhere on the backside of this drawer if the family were men of their word. I kept going, and eventually I came upon the cache by accident. The box was a metal ammo can painted green, tucked under a blowdown where root ball had come up. Inside lay 2 sealed bottles of water, a vacuum-packed gauze roll, a paper packet of iodine tabs, and a small card where the family's initials were burned into it in a single word in fine hand. Honor. I stood with my hands on the rim for a beat because the sight of that word in that box made me want to laugh and throw up in equal measure. And then I took one bottle, screwed it into the canteen, and left the other, and tucked the box back the way I'd found it. The land on the far side of the draw tightened up, the slope pitching to a grade. Blowdowns ran like a picket line, and I had to choose between climbing over, where you risked a twisted knee, and crawling under, where the bark would tear up my back. Late in the morning, the first proof of pursuit showed itself where I'd crossed a patch of mud too broad to dance around. My boot print lay beside another, deeper and a half-inch longer, the heel worn on the outside edge like a man who set his weight on his outer foot to throw his center line off for a punch. The print turned into the brush where I had turned, and the brush told a story. A snag of blue thread on a blackberry cane, a faint smear where a sleeve had brushed all to a shoulder height, and faintest of all, the heat you feel in the air when someone else has been nearby. I scanned the forest upslope and downslope, slow enough that my eyes didn't draw lines instead of seeing, and found nothing. The desire to run cut through me like a hot wire pulled tight. Instead, I moved sideways, careful, using the terrain to make anyone behind me pay as much attention to the ground as to me. The first glimpse came when I made a bad choice and hurried the last few feet across a ribbon of rock showing through a patch of duff. I hopped, slipped, and caught myself with a hand against a cedar trunk. And as I looked up, I saw a shoulder through the ferns 30 yards below and a sliver of face under a brim. The man moved with happiness. I don't know how else to describe it. It was Clay, and the way he traveled uphill felt like a long joke someone had told him that only he got. He didn't see me because he looked where he planned to go, not where someone smarter was hiding. I dropped flat, slid into the crawl space where the wind throw had lifted a mat of roots and dirt, and breathed with my mouth open so the sound wouldn't bunch in one place. Clay passed 5 yards below me and stopped. He crouched, fingers brushing the moss where I'd stood clumsily a minute before, and that grin pulled at his eyebrow scar like someone had tugged a string through his skull. "Gotcha," he said, not loud. He stood and looked uphill, and then, almost politely, turned his back to me to study the slope above like a man admiring a view before moving through it. In that heartbeat, I understood that the only way I got out of this woods was if I made him bleed. The thought was clean, not hateful. Emma's face didn't flash across my mind like a movie. She settled in behind my ribs like a reason to live. I slid out of the roots in one motion, quiet as a fish leaving the shadows. The knife felt heavy and right. Clay was as still as a fence post in profile when I came at him low from behind and to the side. He turned. My blade took him high on the left forearm instead of the kidney I'd meant, and the cut opened him from wrist to near the elbow like a second mouth. Blood sheeted fast and black in the shade. Clay's grin didn't even fade. It changed into something else. He should have jumped back, but he stepped in. The back of his left hand slammed my wrist, and my knife rang metal against a rock, but I didn't drop it. I tightened until the bones in my hand cracked. His right hand found my throat for a half second, and then my chin for leverage, and I understood he was as comfortable in a fight as I was swinging a hammer. We went down together in a knot of limbs and evergreen and breath that smelled like coffee and iron. He got a knee inside my thigh and tried to turn me in by the hip. I drove my head forward, not with the crown but with the ridge above my ear, and I felt his teeth meet his tongue. He hissed not from pain but annoyance, and his right hand went to the knife on his belt. "Don't," I said, and heard how absurd that sounded while the two of us were busy killing each other. He drew anyway because he was a hunter and a man, and he wasn't going to let me write the rules. The blade was a good 3 inches shorter than mine and set for a different job, and that bought me a breath to make a bad situation worse on my terms. I hooked my left heel behind his right ankle and pulled while I shoved his shoulder with my forearm, and he sprawled and he flailed. And in the flail, his left hand sprayed a fan of blood across the ferns like a painter angry with his canvas. I came up with the knife clear and put it into his thigh just above the knee, deep and hard. A doctor's mistake if a doctor had been trained by wolves. The sound he made wasn't a scream and it wasn't a word. And Clay hit me with the handle of his knife across the temple, a solid, polite tap that fuzzed my vision for a beat without turning the lights off.
Good. That's good,
he said through teeth red and white. His leg jerked, hands trying to be everywhere at once, and I knew I'd cut muscle he'd want later. I yanked the blade free, switched hands mid-breath, and cut an ugly line across his forearm near the wound I'd already made. My stomach rolled, not from the blood, but from the intimacy of it, and I swallowed it back because this was a test you didn't stop in the middle of. Somewhere below us, brush ticked like a metronome and a man's voice lifted just enough to carry. "Clay!" Duke called out. Clay's eyes flicked downhill and then back to me, and he grinned again, smaller now and respectful.
"Run,"
he said, and for half a second he could have been Colton or Harlan in paint or something older.
"Earn your life."
I didn't argue with mercy in a place where men had decided to make it rare. I pushed off of him and was gone sideways into the altar before Duke's shadow stood where Clay's had been. I moved bent and quick, cutting a diagonal that would be hard to follow if your eyes wanted straight lines. The first 30 yards were all instinct and leaf litter. The next 50 were a choice not to turn and look. When I let myself glance back through a lattice of branches, I saw Duke kneel, hands calm, pressing his bandana tight against Clay's thigh while Clay did his best impression of a rock. It struck me how domestic the scene would look from the right angle. A brother holding another brother's leg on a soccer field after a bad twist. If you didn't count the knives and the blood, and the rifle slung across Duke's shoulder. Clay seems to have not wanted one for this hunt, as he only had his knife. I heard their voices in pieces as I made distance. Duke said, "High and medial, you bastard," which told me he knew his anatomy too well, and probably his chemistry too, and he knew exactly how to pinch an artery. Clay laughed a dry little bark that wasn't much like his earlier joy.
"He's got hands,"
Clay said, and I couldn't stop the little spark that lit in my chest at the praise of a man who tried to kill me and would again. It looked like I saw them take something out of his pocket and speak into it. Probably Tom. A little while later, I heard the cough of an engine, some kind of ATV to pick him up, I'm assuming at least. When I hit the bench near Banner Top, I let myself walk for the first time since the fight. My legs had a wet cotton feeling that told me I'd burned more fuel than the day had intended for me to burn. I took a long pull from the canteen, then another, and finally bit down on the discipline that told me to stop. I took a minute to pull myself together. The cut on my temple from Clay's love tap had started to dribble along my eyebrow. I smeared it away and felt the dull throb of it answer. The land toward the ridge in front of me opened up. Through a bite in the trees, I could see a run of river on the far side, as silver as a knife's edge. The distance between us, the kind that makes men lie to themselves about how long it'll take to get there. I thought of Tom's finger on the map and his warning not to drop into the holler unless I had a reason. A good reason. Well, it turned out my reason was a bandaged man and a careful man and an old man who hadn't bothered to come out yet. The thought raised itself up, and I turned it over in my mind like a coin. Where was Colton? The answer came not as imagination but as memory. Last night at the table, Clay bragging about first blood, Duke talking about wind, Tom correcting himself mid-sentence, and Colton smiling to himself at the children he'd raised. As I seem to recall, I do think I heard Colton mumble under his breath that he would give them the first morning like a man gives his first son the inheritance. He would let his boys have the first day. He would come later when the land ran clear with our footprints and the wind had its say. For now, I only had to outthink Clay's joy and Duke's caution. One of them I'd already slowed. The other I hadn't met yet. The sound of the ATV had long since faded, and I was assuming that at this point he was back at the cabin, Tom patching him up. By late afternoon, the ache in my calves hadn't gone anywhere. The wind shifted and cooled, and somewhere above, clouds were knitting into weather that hopefully wouldn't make too much trouble for me later. I reached the saddle just below Banner Top and found a place to sit where a stump held me and a strand of huckleberry. I let my heart come down enough that my ears stopped beating. The forest was busy with its own life again. They truly had a huge piece of land out here. No wonder nobody had found out about their little operation. I moved through the forest and kept my thoughts to my daughter about how I needed to live. I tried to black it all out. How I wish I could just turn my mind off at times. My mind was 5 rooms with all the lights on. Duke tracked past me before dusk and didn't even know it later. To his credit, I was hidden pretty well. It had been hard for anybody to find me. He just kept going and walking, stopping, looking at the dirt, the trees, the brush, trying to find my trail. He didn't talk to himself. He didn't call out for me. He didn't even look angry, just thoughtful. He turned into the wind and walked off, and I let him take the wrong page out of this book and said a quiet prayer. Night came early. Earlier than I thought it would, at least. The time seemed to have flown by today. The trees left little light, and eventually it turned dark out. I didn't light the flashlight because I didn't want to be found. Man, they'd have seen me who knows how far off. I almost feel like that was the point of them giving it to me in the first place, to see who's dumb enough to actually use it out here. I checked my knife again. Just wanted to be sure about it. Especially since tomorrow Colton would join the fight. A seasoned hunter, if there ever was one. Who knows how many hunts they'd been on at this point. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, my problem was to stay warm and try to be alive come morning. I don't know how long I slept, but I slept. I woke up countless times throughout the night. Sometime after midnight, something large moved through about 40 yards off. Not hurried, not curious, and the brush made space for it. Bear, maybe. It was truly wild out here. The sun should have been hours away. Who knows when it would get here? It was still dark, but I felt the morning on the way. Somewhere in the country between my pocket and the ridge and the cabin, 2 men with my blood on them and the blood of his brother were planning out what to do with me the next day. Their father, I'm sure, was there also, adding his advice and letting his sons take on the hunt. They were trying to come up with a morning plan. Pin me down, ways to hunt me down, take me out. Somewhere near to them, Tom was washing blood off of his hands at a sink no one would ever see. And Tom still thinking about his school, but how much he did love the country, the wild. I felt a little bad for him. even though, given my circumstances, but he seemed like the odd one out of the family. I closed my eyes, and the last thing I thought about before I fell into more of a shallow sleep was Emma laughing about a joke about a rabbit with a hat. How corny that joke was, but how bad I wish to hear it again someday. I told the dark I would see her soon, and the dark didn't argue. I woke with dirt caked on my cheek and the taste of copper in my mouth. My arms ached from holding the K-bar too tight even in my dreams, and my back was stiff from the log's curve pressing into me all night. For a moment, I thought I heard Emma's laugh again, faint and warm, but it was only a bird calling out in the distance. The world had come back sharp and cold. I crawled out of the hollow and stretched, every muscle stiff, and took a thin drink from the canteen. The water was low. I'd need more soon, and that meant showing myself to the rivers or creeks where eyes could find me. Not much tree cover down there. My hands trembled, not just from thirst, but from the knowledge that the hunt wasn't done. I had an entire day left. Clay was out, but Duke wasn't, and Colton had yet to show himself. The forest wore its morning colors, blue shadows, the pale gold of light working its way between the branches, and the faint steam of dew lifting off of the moss. I moved uphill, careful with every step, trying to make less sound than even the squirrels. The adrenaline of yesterday had burned off. Hopefully my reserves weren't depleted already. By mid-morning, I found a ridge that gave me a slice of view into the valley below. Through the needles and branches, I spotted Duke, moving with the same grace he had last night, patient and deliberate. He paused where I had come down, studied the ground, and kept on. His movements made me nervous. He had picked up my trail. I'd been circling the creek hoping to fill the canteen when I could have swore I felt eyes on me. I froze, and then he appeared. Colton. He didn't come down like the sun's fast and hungry. He came walking as if this was his land, and of course it was, but as if the mountains and trees bowed when he stepped. His shoulders were broad, his beard trimmed but gone to silver at the edges, his eyes calm and steady. He didn't carry a rifle either. He carried a knife, not the military kind I had, but a long hunter's blade with a bone handle that looked worn and smooth from decades of use. I saw that knife on the mantel in the dining room. His clothes were simple, worn canvas and leather. I stayed still, hoping he'd pass, but Colton stopped. His head turned, not quick but slow. I think he already knew I was there. His voice carried across the space deep and even. "Morning, Luke. You've made it further than most." My stomach clenched. I didn't answer. He waited, then went on. "Clay's got some new scars to show the woman folk. He's proud of them, even if he cusses your name for now. Duke says you don't run stupid. I believe him. And me? I wanted to see it for myself. A man worth hunting ought to be worth talking to." He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, his boots hardly bending the grass. I slipped from behind the tree, knife in hand. My throat was dry. "You gonna talk me to death, or are you gonna finish this?" Colton smiled. "You've got fire. Good. But fire burns quick if you don't know how to bank it." Then he lunged. The fight was sudden and violent. His blade flashed and mine answered. Steel on steel in the quiet of the woods. He was stronger, his grip iron, his strikes efficient. Didn't matter how old he was. He had the strength and surety of someone who had been doing this his whole life. I barely kept him from cutting me deep, and every block rattled my bones. He pressed forward, forcing me back toward the creek. I ducked, slashed, caught his sleeve, and drew first blood. He grunted.
That's it, boy.
He drove me into the mud by the water, and the knives became fists, grappling, choking, both of us straining for leverage. His weight crushed me, but desperation gave me strength. I headbutted him hard, and he reeled back long enough for me to slam the knife toward his chest. He caught my wrist with both hands, veins straining, teeth bared. For a moment we were locked. Two men, on the edge of life and death. I twisted, used the mud to slip free, and rolled on top of him. My blade pressed against his throat. His eyes met mine, steady and unafraid.
Do it, he rasped. Prove to me you're more than prey.
My arm shook. I could have killed him right there. But I couldn't. I couldn't do it. I was here for Emma. I was fighting to survive for Emma. I couldn't turn into a monster in the process of saving her. So instead, I drove the blade into his shoulder, deep enough to cripple him, but not to kill. He sucked in a breath and let out a ragged laugh. I shoved away and staggered to my feet. Colton tried to rise, but couldn't. His hand pressed the wound, blood dark against his shirt. Still, he grinned up at me like I'd given him a gift.
Go on. The day ain't done. Let's see if you can outrun the rest of it.
I didn't wait. I ran, lungs burning, the sound of his laughter following me through the trees. By late afternoon, I was ragged, my body a map of bruises and cuts. I'd somehow managed to lose him for the moment. The canteen was nearly empty again, and my stomach gnawed itself. Every step hurt, but I kept moving. When the sun began to sink, I found a hollow where cedar roots had tangled into a natural shelter. I collapsed inside, knife across my chest heaving. My mind went to Emma again. Her smile, her laugh, her small hand in mine. For her, I would see the dawn. The second night pressed down like a weight, and every bone in my body begged me to lie down and let it end. My legs shook, my throat burned with thirst, and the knife felt heavier than anything should. But I kept moving, because stopping meant Duke would find me. He was out there. I felt him more than saw him, like a shadow stitched to the trees, always a half step behind. Every time I paused, I'd catch the faintest rustle. I tried tricks, doubling back through a creek, scaling a ridge too steep, even crawling on my belly through brush so thick it tore my arms raw. Each time I thought I'd lost him, the woods answered with his presence again. Hours bled away. My vision blurred, my body hollowed. By the time the first hint of gray showed through the canopy, I could barely keep my feet. My head sagged against a cedar trunk, and my eyes betrayed me, fluttering shut. Then Duke stepped out. 10 yards away, calm as the dawn itself, he tossed the gun that he had in his hands to the ground. He picked up his knife, his eyes bright with that same quiet hunger. "Almost over," he said. His voice was soft, southern, and steady. "Ooh, I haven't had a hunt like this in a while." I forced myself upright, raising my K-bar, though my arm trembled like a branch in the wind. "Come on, then." He tilted his head, studying me like I was another line of spore in the dirt. Then he advanced. No wasted steps, no bravado, just a hunter closing distance. I staggered forward, both of us circling in a patch of pale light seeping through the trees. When his blade slashed, I blocked, sparks in my bones. When I stabbed, he flowed aside, answering with a slice that carved my sleeve. He was measured, patient, letting exhaustion do the work for him. His blade darted in and out, always searching for the smallest slip. My arms felt like sandbags, my feet leaden, and then he cut me. A sharp line of fire lanced across my ribs as knife grazed me. shallow but enough to make me hiss and stumble. Duke's eyes lit up, the look of a man who'd found the weakness he was waiting for. He surged forward, relentless. Steel flashed again, carving across my forearm as I barely caught his wrist in time to keep the blade from going deeper. Pain ripped through me, but some animal corner of myself refused to let go. I slammed my forehead into his nose. He grunted, stumbled back, but didn't fall. Blood ran from his nostrils, but he only smiled, hungry and certain. We crashed together, knives colliding in jerks and jolts of steel, too close now for finesse. His shoulder hit my chest, we went down in a heap, and the ground punched the air from my lungs. We rolled in the pine needles, both snarling, both desperate, neither given an inch. My hand strained, forcing his blade aside, while I drove my knife down inch by inch toward his chest. Duke fought with everything in him, his teeth bared, breath hot against my cheek. He twisted, trying to throw me off, but I pinned him with a knee and shoved harder. The tip of my knife kissed skin. Just a prick, a bead of blood rising on his sternum. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in grim acknowledgement. He knew I had him. And then, the siren. It ripped through the forest like judgment itself, a long, deafening wail that shook the marrow in my bones. My blade froze, my whole body locked in place. Duke's chest heaved beneath me, and for a heartbeat we were statues locked in the oldest struggle there is. Then I tore myself back. With a ragged cry, I ripped the knife away, shoved off of him, and collapsed onto my back in the needles. My chest convulsed, every breath a gasp between laughter and sobbing. My vision blurred with tears and sweat, the world spinning above me. Duke lay where he was, chest rising and falling, the bead of blood on his skin shining in the gray light of dawn. Slowly, he turned his head toward me.
You stopped.
His voice was hoarse, almost reverent. I couldn't answer. I just lay there, knife still in my hand, my body shaken from more than exhaustion. The siren faded, leaving silence heavy and absolute. The rules were real. The hunt was over. I got to my feet, slowly but surely, and as he lay there, I looked into the woods and picked a direction and walked. The woods spat me out sometime mid-morning. I staggered through the last line of pines and found myself staring at a strip of cracked asphalt running like a scar through nowhere. My knees buckled in relief. A road. Civilization. The promise that this nightmare had an edge I could step over. I kept walking. My body was a wreck. Every step a hammer to my heels, every breath cutting through my chest. But the rhythm of the road cut me upright. Sunlight broke through the trees in shards, warming the crown of my head. After 2 days in the timber's dark lungs, the open sky felt like mercy. I don't know how long I walked, minutes, hours, maybe half my life. The road didn't care. It just stretched on, and I thought about Emma, about holding her hand in that hospital bed, about being able to tell her that I'd done it, that her father hadn't broken, that in the last minute I stopped myself from taking another man's life when I could have. To tell her that her father hadn't broken, that money was coming, hope, for once, wasn't a word I had to lie about. The growl of an engine reached me long before the truck appeared. My chest tightened, tires on gravel. Then the crunch as a dark green pickup rolled alongside me, dust curling off its wheels. My fingers wrapped tight around the K-bar in my belt, though I wasn't sure I had the strength to use it. The driver's window rolled down. Colton leaned out, one hand bandaged across his shoulder, his face lined but smiling.
Damn, you really did it,
he drawled, voice warm and deep. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. "It's over," I said, more to myself than to him. Colton nodded slowly. "That's right, it's over. I had to go back to the house after you laid me open. Couldn't swing steel with this arm. So I left Duke to finish what we started. He called me and told me what happened this morning, about how it ended." His smile widened. "Said you had him pinned, knife to his chest. Could have finished him, rules be damned, no one would have known. But you didn't. You stopped the second that siren sang its song. You don't know how rare that is, boy. Most men lose themselves out here." The knife felt heavy at my side, useless now. I wasn't out there to prove anything. I was out there for Emma. My voice cracked on her name. Killing you, Duke, anybody, it wouldn't have changed that. I just needed to survive. Colton chuckled low in his chest. "And you did. Better than most who've come through here. Hell, better than nearly all. Money's already in your account, ready to be used and spent. $500,000 like we promised. No tricks." For a moment, the only sound was the tick of his engine, the lazy caw of a crow overhead. Then he leaned across the seat, arm hanging from the window. "I'll give you a ride if you want. Town ain't far." I shook my head. "No thanks, I'll walk." His eyes lingered on me, measuring, maybe even approving. Finally, he pointed down the road with his chin. 2 hours if you keep straight. The pavement'll take you right in. You'll see the church steeple first. White, tall, and hard to miss." He paused, the faintest grin curling one side of his mouth. "Oh, one of the best hunts I've had since I was my kid's age and hunting with my daddy. Why, thank you, Luke." Then, with a wink, he put the truck in gear. Gravel spat from the tires, and the truck rumbled down the road until it was swallowed by the trees. I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. My legs trembled, but I forced them forward, step after step, the empty road stretching toward a life I thought I'd lost. Emma's face filled my mind. Her laugh, her eyes. I'd done what I had to do. Things I didn't know I was capable of. The forest, the blood, the fight. All of it would stay with me, carved into bone. The shadow of the hunt would never leave. But I'd survived. For her. For us. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitors and the slant of street light through the blinds. Emma lay curled on her side, small chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. Her hair was messy, cheeks pale, but her lips parted in that soft way kids do when sleep is deep and safe. I sank into the chair beside her bed, every muscle screaming from everything I had done the day before. But none of it mattered. I reached out and brushed her hand with my thumb, careful not to wake her. She stirred, sighed, and settled again. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe. I pulled my phone from my pocket, checking it again, half afraid of what I'd see, and opened my banking app. $500,000. Exactly as Colton promised. No tricks, no lies. I sat there, staring at it until my eyes blurred, laughter and tears tangling in my throat. $500,000. Enough to buy her a chance. I looked back at Emma, at the soft rhythm of her sleep. I whispered, "We're gonna be okay, baby girl." I did it. I kept my promise. Her fingers twitched in mine, and though she didn't wake, I took it as an answer. I leaned back, exhausted beyond words, knife scars burning, mind still echoing with sirens and shadows. But I was here, with her. And for the first time, hope didn't feel like a lie.